Chapter 176, Messenger. On this day, Heath was busy in the laboratory. Why is the acidity of mugwort leaves so high? Try adding a bit of starlight grass. Strange, is there a problem with Baghdad's rune arrangement and replaced it with Cass's rune arrangement? In front of the long wooden table, Heath was busy among the bottles and jars, shaking the test tube from time to time, and sometimes putting some strange materials into the beaker. Hiss! 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 At that moment, a hiss suddenly came from outside the window. At the same time, an elemental fluctuation came from outside. The fluctuation was so weak that it could not even reach the energy needed to trigger the alarm switch. What was that? Heath put down the test tube in his hand and looked out of the window. Then, he saw a big python appear outside the window, crawling up the mottled outer wall. When it came to the windowsill, the snake coiled its tail and raised its head. While spitting out its tongue, it spoke in human language. "May I ask if Heath Noen lives here?" Heath said, "That's me." The snake looked very happy. "Aya, I've finally found you. It wasn't easy on the way here." Heath raised his eyebrows. "And you are?" The snake introduced itself simply. "My name is Kara, and I'm a messenger. Here is a letter for you." After saying that, its big mouth opened up from top to bottom, and then its stomach bulged up and quickly rolled out toward its throat. Soon, an egg was spat on the wooden table. With a click, the eggshell was opened. There was no egg yolk inside, but a letter. The snake swung its tail and pushed the letter in front of Heath. "This is your letter, Sir Heath Noen." Heath took the letter and asked casually, "Who sent it to me?" The snake said, "Shadow Tower." Heath was stunned. He looked down and indeed saw the emblem of Shadow Tower in the lower right corner of the letter. He opened the letter and read it. Soon, he finished reading the letter. Heath could not help but frown. This was a recruitment order from Shadow Tower. The content of the letter was roughly the same as the two wizards from the Tower of Order yesterday. It was also to recruit him to a place called the Bloody Battlefield. Putting down the letter, Heath asked, "What is this bloody battlefield?" The snake shook its head. "I'm just a messenger. You can't expect a messenger to know what's written on the letter, but I can suggest you ask the wizard who sent the letter to you." "You don't need to say that." Heath nodded and took out 2 magic stones. "Thank you." The snake's eyes lit up when it saw the magic stones. It opened its mouth and swallowed the 2 magic stones. "Thank you, you are the most generous wizard I have ever met." It thanked the other party sincerely, then it twisted the snake's body and quickly retreated along the path it came from. Returning to his chair, Heath fell into deep thought as he looked at the letter in his hand. This bloody battlefield. What exactly is it? In the afternoon, Paul came to report to Heath about the plague that had happened at Cavalim. Heath had unintentionally raised the issue of the bloody battlefield with him, but he did not expect to find the answer here. The bloody battlefield. Paul's expression obviously changed. Heath raised his eyebrows. "You know about it?" Paul nodded. "I heard my mentor mention it before. It seems that because of something, the wizards of the West Coast will have a war with the Forest Tribe every once in a while, and the location of the war is the bloody battlefield." Heath was a little surprised. The Forest Tribe. The Forest Tribe and the Sea Tribe were the same. They were also one of the 9 great races. They were also the races that the wizards had a lot of contact with. For example, the raven and the snake that brought the message before were all intelligent species of the Forest Tribe. However, according to what Heath knew, the relationship between the Forest Tribe and the wizards should be quite good. This war was. Paul said with some difficulty, "I'm not too sure about the specifics, it seems like there's some agreement between the 2 races, or something." Heath did not continue asking. "Okay, I got it." Among the wizards, he was considered to be knowledgeable. Even he did not know about this, so it was even more impossible for Paul to know. Paul continued to ask, "Then what did you decide, Heath? Are you going?" Heath hesitated for a moment. If he were to go, he definitely wouldn't want to go. This battlefield was obviously not something fun. But this was not a matter of whether he wanted to go or not. Heath looked at the letter in his hand. In the lower right corner of the letter, there was a strange pattern. It was like the pattern of the roots of a tree entangled together. Behind the roots, there was a pair of overlapping magic wands. The emblem of the ruler. There was no new ruler in the Underdark Treesia. From a legal point of view, Shadow Tower still had the status of a ruler, so it was understandable for them to exercise their authority. The ruler had issued a recruitment order. All wizards in the Underdark Trezia, regardless of whether they were organized or not, as long as they lived in this land, they had to accept the recruitment unconditionally. Those who did not accept it were treated as dark wizards. Paul said, Shadow Tower is already in such a state. Why bother with them? If you want me to say it, don't bother. Just burn the letter and finish it. Heath shook his head. It's not that simple. Previously, he had always thought that Shadow Tower would not be able to do it. However, after the incident at the Tower of Order yesterday, Heath felt that it might not be as he had thought. It was not up to the wizards in the Underdark Trezia to decide who was the ruler of the Underdark Trezia. It was up to the Tower of Order to decide. As for the relationship between Shadow Tower, the Tower of Order, and the war, Heath did not know. Anyway, from the beginning of the war, he had felt that there was something strange about it. It was definitely not as simple as pushing it to Shadow Tower. In short, Shadow Tower was still the legitimate ruler. If Heath still wanted to survive here, he had to accept their recruitment order. Heath said, I'll go and take a look first. Paul said, then, be careful. I heard from my teacher that this bloody battlefield seems to be very dangerous. Heath nodded. I understand. Pausing for a moment, Heath continued, in addition, leave the plague over at Cavalim to me. I'll go and see what the situation is like. The plague happened to be near the land of darkness. Paul said, yes. Heath did not have the habit of delaying. The next day after he made his decision, he simply packed his luggage and set off for Cavalim. This was a town in the northwestern part of the Kingdom of Navi. It was located at the edge of the Underdark Trezia and was 2 days away from the land of darkness. In the past, there were even wizards from Shadow Tower who came here to buy supplies. 2 days later, Cavalim, the Kingdom of Navi. Dong! Dong! The solemn bell of the auditorium rang and the carriage of the Holy Church slowly drove into the city gate. Sitting in the carriage, Heath lifted the curtains of the carriage and looked out. His brows were tightly knitted together. On both ends of the road, there were many figures lying in disorder. The clergy of the Holy Church shuttled back and forth, diagnosing and treating the patients. Whenever someone died, there would be a knight who would put up the corpses and carry them away at a unit price. Although he had heard Paul and the others describe the scene here before coming here, this kind of miserable state still underestimated Heath's expectations. In the past 10 years, after Paul and the others' careful management, the few towns in Heath's territory had been doing quite well. It had been a long time since he had seen such a scene. He turned his head to look at the bishop who was accompanying him. When did this plague start? Tell me in detail. Bishop Beagle was a middle-aged man in his 40s. He was the brother of Lord Cavalim. Heath had come here to become a bishop after he had introduced this set of order. There were many people in the Holy Church. Heath could not bring out so many wizards. Most of the clergy only used mortals to take up the post. Moreover, it was better to leave the mortals' territory to the mortals to manage. Beagle said, yes, sir, the thing is. Then, Beagle told Heath in detail about the whole story of the plague. Chapter 177, Plague. The plague started 2 weeks ago. One day, a large number of residents in the city fell ill. Before that, there were no symptoms, as if the virus had suddenly appeared all at once. Heath asked, there were no signs before the plague happened? For example, when a patient entered the city. Beagle shook his head. No, sir. At first, we also considered whether it was the season or the weather, but the weather has been very good recently, and the seasons have not changed. After that, we also considered looking for the source of the infection, but we could not find it. It was as if the patients had appeared overnight. That day, a large number of patients poured into the church, and we were sure that we have never seen it before. Heath asked, have you tried to give them holy water? Beagle said, when the patients first appeared, we used holy water to save them, but it didn't have any effect. Heath frowned. Holy water was a healing potion that he had specially prepared using a variety of materials. In theory, it should have an excellent effect on these pestilence diseases. Beagle sighed and said, I really didn't expect the calamity of hyenas to fall on us. Heath asked, the calamity of hyenas? Beagle nodded and said, yes, sir. This is not the first time this kind of plague has appeared. In the past 2 years, there have been outbreaks in many places. They are just like hyenas. They break out in one place and bring disaster to this place. When almost everyone is dead, they suddenly disappear, and then they break out in another place. Listening to Beagle's story, Heath narrowed his eyes. He had a clue. If his guess was right, this plague was probably. The carriage drove all the way to the city, and finally stopped in front of the newly built cathedral in the city. Heath and his entourage got off the carriage. There were only a few more patients here than in the city. There were people lying everywhere on the stone steps in front of the cathedral. The wailing continued. Ah! Save me! Lord Priest! Save me! I'm in so much pain! I'm in so much pain! Who can help me? Who can save me? Heath walked in front of a patient and carefully observed him. He called a clergyman next to him to ask about his condition. There was nothing special about his appearance. He was not much different from a normal human being who had a fever. His face was pale, his whole body was hot, and he was weak and feeble. What was slightly special was that red spots would grow all over his body after the onset of the disease. From the appearance of the red spots, it indicated that the patient had started to develop the disease, and the period from the onset of the disease to death was about 3 days. That's all we know, sir, the priest said to Heath. Heath nodded. Okay, I understand. Then, he bent down and opened the patient's eyelids to look at his eyeballs. After observing it for a while, he suddenly took out a bell from his dimensional pocket and shook it lightly. This was a negative element particle detection bell. It was a kind of wizard tool that was used to detect negative elements. It had excellent effects on poisons, dark elements, corrosive elements, and many other things. It could discover many things that were hidden very deeply. Ding! A clear bell rang. Along with this sound, a strange scene appeared. Under the patient's skin, dark green worm-like things suddenly appeared. Heath immediately stretched out his finger and gently cut at the patient's skin. With a pu sound, a wound naturally opened up, facing the direction of the worm. After the skin was cut open, one could clearly see that there were actually small bugs hidden in the flesh below. It was just a worm. Its appearance was similar to an earthworm, but at the top was a tiny upper body that seemed to be the upper body of some kind of cat, with a pair of sharp little claws. This? What kind of monster is this? How can there be such a thing? The bishop and the clergy were shocked. Looking at the densely packed worm squirming in his skin, they felt their scalps go numb. After the worms were exposed, they hurriedly tried to escape to the sides or deeper into their muscles, but they were blocked by Heath's wizard's force field. Then, Heath used his dagger to pick out a strange bug. The exposed bug immediately bared its fangs and brandished its claws at Heath, showing a fierce look. Heath looked at the strange bug and his eyes couldn't help but light up. Actor Abyss Worm. This was the same as the abyssal queen worm he saw in the magic bug forest. It was also from the abyss. Its scientific name was Actor Abyss Worm, a type of abyss worm. This kind of worm had a very strong reproductive ability. It liked to invade animals, especially human bodies, to lay eggs and reproduce. A single abyss worm like this could multiply tens or millions of times in just a few days. Heath asked, "Have there been any suspicious people in the city recently?" Bishop Beagle thought for a moment and said, "There are no suspicious people, but if you want to talk about strangers, there were indeed a few people who came a few days ago. They claimed to be wizards, and those lords were very kind to help treat the patients. They also said that the plague was spread by someone with malicious intent." Heath said in surprise, "Wizards? Did they say where they came from?" Bishop Beagle shook his head. "No, my lord." Heath thought for a moment. Then, he put down the patient. "Bandage his wound." Bishop Beagle stepped forward and said, "Then my lord. Those bugs. Don't you need to deal with them?" Everyone had seen the dense swarm of insects just now. Heath shook his head and said, "Not for the time being." After a pause, he continued, "Those two wizards were right. This plague is indeed not naturally formed, but someone has maliciously poisoned them." The crowd was shocked. "Ah! What? Someone poisoned them? Who did it? It's too abominable. Who on earth is so vicious?" Beagle was also surprised. "Sir, is this true?" Heath nodded. "It's absolutely true. The Actor Abyss Worm was not contagious. If someone had not spread it maliciously, such a large area would not have been affected. This person is too evil. Why would he do that? He has such a vicious heart. No matter who it is, we must find out who it is. The crowd was agitated. Beagle frowned. Sir, then what should we do now? Heath said, leave it to me. No matter what this guy's motive was, he actually came to his territory to do evil. Then, he should be prepared to bear his anger. Chapter 178, An Old Friend. It was night, in a forest on the outskirts of Kavalim. In order to dispose of the bodies infected with the plague, Kavalim city had specially dug a large pit in the forest on the outskirts. The people who died from the plague were carried here and then agreed to be buried afterward. Da-da-da. The sound of footsteps echoed in the forest. 2 men who were in charge of handling the corpses were carrying a stretcher in the forest. On the stretcher was a civilian who had just died from the plague. They looked terrified and kept looking left and right. Soon, the 2 of them arrived at the burial pit. It was a huge pit with a radius of hundreds of square meters. In the huge pit, there were corpses lying in all directions. Their pale faces and dead eyes were extremely terrifying under the moonlight. Gulp. The 2 men could not help but shiver and swallow their saliva. Yay! Yay! Suddenly, 2 dry screeches sounded. A crow flew over and hovered on a treetop. At this time, it was tilting its head and looking at the 2 people under the tree with its scarlet eyes. The sudden sound startled the 2 civilians. Their bodies trembled and the corpses on the stretcher slid into the huge pit. Damn it, damn bird! You scared me! A man picked up a stone and threw it at the treetop. The crow miraculously moved to the side to avoid it. You, look, what? What is that? At this moment, a man seemed to have noticed something and suddenly pointed at the trembling corpse in the pit. The corpse that they had just thrown down suddenly opened its mouth for no reason. Ah! The men's expressions changed drastically as they screamed and quickly ran away. Not long after the 2 of them left. Rustle, rustle. A strange sound was heard. A dense swarm of insects suddenly surged out from the man's open mouth. The scene was extremely terrifying. The insects that emerged were very strange. They looked like earthworms, but at the top was a strange creature with sharp teeth and claws. After coming out of the man's mouth, they gathered on the man's body, as if waiting for something. The crow on the tree stared at the scene on the ground without blinking. This crow was naturally Heath. Since the unknown plague disperser had chosen to use humans to nurture the actor abyss worm, as long as he kept an eye on the actor abyss worm's location, he would naturally be able to uncover the mastermind behind it. Thus, Heath specially arranged for someone to find a corpse that had just died and send it over. He then followed closely behind and used the transformation spell to transform into a crow. Ding-ling! Suddenly, a clear sound rang out. It was the sound of a bell. Ding-ling! Suddenly, a figure appeared outside the forest. It was a woman. She was wrapped in a black cloak. Her appearance was quite beautiful, but the palms of her hands had 2 mouths. She looked extremely strange. Seeing this woman, Heath could not help but be stunned. He had seen this woman before. It was when he had just left Shadow Tower 10 years ago. She was one of the 3 dark wizard apprentices. She was holding a bell in her hand. As she gently shook it, she walked toward the pit. The bell seemed to have some strange magic power. After hearing the sound, the insects in the pit climbed out of the pit together and swarmed toward the witch. The witch squatted down and pressed her palm against the ground. Her long scarlet tongue stuck out and licked the surroundings. Crunch, crunch. The crisp sound of chewing was heard continuously. As if enjoying some kind of delicious food, the mouth began to devour these insects. Oh! At the same time, the witch seemed to enjoy a feast of gluttony. She was murmuring uncontrollably as if she was having an orgasm. Green gas emerged from her body and twirled around her body. It looked unusually strange. Heath, who was on the treetops, suddenly understood. So that's how it is. Is this some kind of special training method? Using humans to rear actor abyss worms and then devouring actor abyss worms to absorb the elemental content of the worms after they multiplied in large numbers was a good way to quickly increase one's strength. I just don't know how she deals with the problem of elemental rejection. Let's capture her and ask her. With this thought in mind, Heath was ready to show himself and take down the culprit. But at this moment, he suddenly looked to the side of the forest. Just now, he suddenly felt several slight elemental fluctuations coming from that side, and these elemental fluctuations seemed to be a little familiar. The witch under the tree had the strength of an advanced apprentice 10 years ago, and now she had already reached the peak, and her spiritual sense was also very strong. After Heath, she quickly noticed the elemental fluctuations. She immediately stopped devouring the actor abyss worms and suddenly stood up, looking over vigilantly. "Who is it? Come out." The forest was quiet for a while. Then, rustle. The bushes shook, and a few figures walked out from there. There were 2 men and 2 women who walked out. They were all wearing grey-black apprentice cloaks, and the chest of the cloaks was embroidered with the pattern of Shadow Tower. They were all apprentices of Shadow Tower. After seeing these people, Heath finally knew where the familiar feeling came from. Jessica, Jenny, Ender, and Ike. These 4 people were obviously apprentices who were at the same time as him. After 10 years of not seeing each other, it was obvious that everyone had made great progress. Judging from the spiritual power that they had received, Jenny, Ender, and Ike had already reached the intermediate apprentice stage, and Jessica even had the spiritual fluctuation of an advanced apprentice. As soon as the 4 of them walked out of the forest, they surrounded the witch in front of them in an umbrella-shaped formation. The witch glanced at the 4 of them and asked with suspicion, "Shadow Tower?" She sneered and said scornfully, "Why did you stray dogs come here instead of lying in the shadows?" The faces of the 4 of them darkened. Jenny was the first to step out and said coldly, "Filthy maggot of the Dark Wizard region, did you attack Parker?" The witch thought for a moment and said, "Parker, are you talking about the boy with a big head who can transform into a werewolf?" She raised her thumb and pursed her lips as if she was provoking the witch. He tasted good. The 4 of them suddenly had red eyes. Parker was one of their apprentices. They had been playing together since they entered Shadow Tower. They had been together for a long time, and they had a good relationship. "Then pay with your life." Jessica snorted angrily and didn't waste any words. She immediately used a flame to burn the witch. At the same time, Jenny, who was next to her, also took the opportunity to summon a tornado. Wind and fire came together. When the tornado was covered with flames, it immediately formed a flaming tornado, which greatly increased its power. The rest of the apprentices, Andrew and Ike, respectively, summoned a thorn and a chain to entangle the witch, trapping her so that she couldn't move. Heath's eyes lit up when he saw this scene. In his impression, these 4 guys were just noobs, but now they were well coordinated and well organized, which surprised him greatly. Unfortunately, they were just noobs. Facing the 4's attack, the witch snorted and said disdainfully, "You're courting death." As she spoke, she raised her right hand, and a barrier formed by water elements stood in front of her. The fire tornado collided with it with a loud bang, and then instantly collapsed. At the same time, a large amount of dark green fog suddenly surged out of her body. This fog seemed to be extremely corrosive. The moment it came into contact with the chains and thorns wrapped around her body, they heard a puchy-puchy sound. These chains and thorns instantly melted like black candles. The witch who had escaped from control suddenly raised her hands, and a large amount of poisonous fog immediately gushed out from her palms and enveloped the few of them. Seeing this, Jessica hurriedly stepped forward and raised her hands up. A flame shield appeared and enveloped the few of them. However, her flame shield was no match for the poisonous fog. As soon as the poisonous fog hit it, there was a puchy-puchy sound, and the shield melted at a speed visible to the naked eye. Jessica's expression changed and she quickly said, "Everyone, retreat." The apprentices did not waste any time and quickly retreated. "Humph! Ha, you want to run?" The witch sneered and then raised her hand toward Jessica, who was retreating slowly. Suddenly, the ground bulged up and a spike shot up from below. Everyone was shocked. "Jessica! Be careful!" Jessica was in a situation where the protective shield was broken. She could not defend against the spike at all and was about to be penetrated by it. But at this moment, bang! For no reason, the spike suddenly ignited into a ball of flame. The power of this flame was extremely shocking. As soon as it appeared, it burned with the spikes and instantly burned the spikes into ashes. Jessica, who had avoided it, broke out in a cold sweat. She looked at the burning flame in front of her, still in shock. Everyone quickly surrounded her and protected her. "Jessica, are you okay?" "I'm fine." At the same time, the witch's face suddenly became serious. She suddenly looked at the tree trunk and stared at the crow on the tree trunk with a cold expression. She said coldly, "Who are you? I advise you to mind your own business. Otherwise, you won't even know how you died." A leisurely voice came from the tree, "So what if I do?" Hearing this voice, Jessica was slightly stunned. She inexplicably felt that this voice seemed to be somewhat familiar. The witch was furious. "You're courting death." She released a large amount of poisonous fog from her hands and gathered towards the crow on the tree. This dark green poisonous fog was like water, touching the tree trunk. The tree actually melted in the blink of an eye. However, the crow seemed to be completely unharmed in the depths of the poisonous fog. The witch's expression became serious. Flap, flap, flap. The sound of wings flapping could be heard. The crow flapped its wings and flew down from the tree trunk. During the process of falling, the crow began to twist, transform, and expand. A small crow quickly elongated and grew. By the time the crow landed, it had already transformed into a slender man with a black cloak hanging from his waist in the night wind. At the same time, the faces of the witch, Jessica, and the others, changed at the same time. This was because this man seemed to be releasing an extremely powerful energy wave that belonged only to wizards. Chapter 179, Genius. Roxanne's expression changed drastically. She did not hesitate at all. Boom! She immediately turned into a ball of mist and fled. However, in the face of the absolute difference in strength, what was the point of her fleeing? Seeing that she was about to flee, Heath was not in a hurry to chase after her. He only lightly raised his right hand and clenched it. This simple action instantly set off a substantial ripple in the air. With the fog as the center, an extremely strong pressure swept over from all directions and contracted. Under the effect of this strong pressure, the fog squeezed, deformed, and finally turned back into the witch Roxanne who had just disappeared. Puff! She opened her mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. Then, she fell heavily to the ground from the air. Before she could say a word, she fainted. Heath took out a space bottle from his pocket and walked forward. When he came in front of the fallen Roxanne, he did not say anything. He casually grabbed upwards and a ball of flame was caught in his hand. Then, he threw it at Roxanne who was on the ground, and the flame pounced on Roxanne's body. For a moment, one could only hear a putchy sound. The flame licked Roxanne who was on the ground like a tongue and very quickly burned her entire body. In an instant, this body was reduced to ashes. At the same time, he raised the glass bottle in his hand and chanted a short incantation towards Roxanne who was on the ground. Roxanne's corpse on the ground suddenly surged out balls of blue energy and poured into the glass bottle in Heath's hand. They formed a transparent little person in the bottle. It was Roxanne. Jessica and the others felt their scalps go numb when they saw this scene. A peak-level high-level apprentice was actually killed and her soul was extracted in an instant. She didn't even have the chance to escape. This kind of strength was truly terrifying. Done. After corking the bottle, Heath kept the spatial bottle and then took out Roxanne's spatial pocket from the pile of charred bodies. Then, he turned around. It was just a simple action, but it made the apprentices behind him tremble. Their defensive spells were activated almost instantly. Heath was speechless. He laughed and said, "Is this how you welcome your old friend?" They were all stunned. Jenny said, "Sir, what do you mean?" It was not their fault that they did not realize it. After all, they had not seen each other for 10 years. During this time, Heath had advanced to a wizard, and his temperament had changed drastically. It was only natural that they could not recognize him. However, after using traceless time, Heath's appearance did not change much. Soon, someone recognized his handsome face. "Heath?" Jessica asked with uncertainty, "Are you Heath?" As though a stone had been thrown into a calm lake, Jessica's words caused an uproar. "Heath? It's Heath. That's impossible, right? How is that possible? He was only an intermediate-level apprentice when he left the tower. But it really seems like..." With Jessica's reminder, the rest of the people recognized the familiar face in their memories. However, they found it hard to believe this shocking guess. After all, 10 years ago, Heath was only an apprentice. And he was an apprentice who entered the tower at the same time as them. Seeing how everyone wanted to recognize him but didn't dare to, Heath felt a little funny. He said generously, "No need to doubt, it's me." After a pause, he said in a friendly tone, "Jessica, Jenny, Andrew, Ike, long time no see." Hearing Heath say their names one by one, it instantly crushed their guesses. Everyone's jaws dropped and their eyeballs almost fell out. "Heath! Heath! Oh my god, it's really you!" Later, Heath learned that Jessica and the others had appeared here because they had been ordered to buy some daily necessities and various low-level resources needed for daily use in the tower. After the accident 10 years ago, these things had to be taken care of by the apprentices themselves. Therefore, Shadow Tower could only send apprentices to buy or get them, and this time, they were chosen. However, who would have thought that in the wood, one of them would be killed for no reason after they came to the city? They followed the clues to find the murderer all the way to the forest, and then the scene just now happened. Jessica said with some lingering fear, "We thought that it was just an ordinary apprentice, but we never thought that the other party would be a dark wizard, and an advanced apprentice at that. If we didn't meet you this time, I'm afraid we wouldn't be able to go back." Everyone felt a lingering fear. Then, Jessica smiled and asked, "Let's talk about you. Why are you here?" At this point, she looked up and down at Heath in surprise. "And, you really have advanced to a wizard?" Heath said casually, "I just broke through not long ago." Although they already knew Heath's strength, they still couldn't help but exclaim when they heard him admit it himself. "Holy shit! You're too fierce! Wizard! Oh my god! We clearly started together, right? We started learning magic together." Everyone had mixed feelings. They had all entered Shadow Tower at the same time and embarked on the path of a wizard at the same time. However, after more than 10 years, they were only intermediate and advanced apprentices, while Heath had already become a wizard. One had to know. In the minds of most of the apprentices here, a wizard was their biggest goal in their lives. Jessica said with a bitter smile, "Not long ago, I was happy to be promoted to an advanced apprentice, but compared to you, I realized how childish and ridiculous I am." Heath shrugged, "The sooner or later, you will definitely achieve it in the future." Jessica sighed. "I hope so." The more she walked down the path of a wizard, the more difficult it was. Then, she gathered the negative emotions in her body. It was rare to see an old friend, so she couldn't spread these negative emotions. She smiled and said, "Although it shocked us, it's not surprising. We said a long time ago that if one of us really advanced to a wizard, we have no doubt that it would be you. Now, you really did it!" she exclaimed, the black-haired genius of Shadow Tower. Genius! The magic genius of Shadow Tower. Chapter 180, First Sight. After returning to the city, Heath started to deal with the plague. He had already dealt with the source of the plague, the dark wizards, so the rest was easy to deal with. There were many ways to deal with the actor abyss worms. Heath used the simplest method, the devouring method. To put it simply, he would directly eat the plague and the actor abyss worms. The actor abyss worm was a parasite. Although it had incredible reproductive ability, its strength was no different from ordinary worms. It was a rare delicacy for many creatures in nature, for example, birds. After all, most birds ate worms. According to this principle, Heath made a wizard tool, the crow mask. This was a wizard tool made of crow's beak, brown cow skin, red crystal, black feathers, burqa, resin gloves, and other materials. It was given a specific rune by Heath to specifically target the actor abyss worms. As long as a cut was made on the patient's body and the appropriate blood was released, the crow mask would automatically activate and release a unique smell. This smell would lure the actor abyss worms out of the patient's body. After that, the mask would transform into the avatars of crows and eat all the actor abyss worms that came out. These actor abyss worms that were eaten would then be converted into elemental energy, causing the crow mask to be able to summon the avatars of crows again. By relying on this method, one would be able to solve the problems caused by the actor abyss worms without needing to consume magic stones. Kingdom of Navi, Kavalim City. After seeing the worms, there's no need to be afraid. Leave everything to the crows. Yes, my lord. In the spacious hall of Kavalim Church, there were many simple hospital beds that were formed from animal skins, cloth, and so on. There was a patient lying on each bed. Some people dressed strangely were busying themselves in front of the patients. They were all wearing burqas made of black feathers. On their faces was a leather mask with a big crow's beak. On their hands were gloves made of resin. The sound of scalpels cutting through flesh and blood vessels echoed in the hall from time to time. These crow people cut open the patient's blood vessels one after another and used silver basins to receive the patient's blood. Along with the blood, there were also some strange-looking insects that were driven away like earthworms and beast-like heads. These little things squeaked and fell into the blood in the silver basin. Immediately, the blood seemed to boil up and it jumped in the blood continuously. At this time, the black feathers on the crows' robes would fall down and turn into crows. These crows flew to the silver basin and their long beaks began to feast on the insects in the blood. When they were full, the crows' robes would grow new feathers. Bishop Beagle looked at this strange scene and his eyes were filled with surprise. He exclaimed, "Lord Heath, you really opened my eyes. The crows you brought saved Cavaleem. You saved everyone here." Heath said indifferently, "This is what I should do." Beagle looked at the crows who were wearing strange clothes and praised, "Such a strange image has never appeared in this world before. What should I call them? Lord Heath. What should he call them?" Heath thought for a moment and said casually, "Doctor. Crow Doctor." At this point, there was a new profession in the wizard world. It was said that they all had magical powers. Every time someone got sick, they would put on a robe with a skin mask sewn with the beak of a crow and cut open the patient's blood vessels to treat the patient. They would drive away the patient's pain and plague. People called them the Crow Doctor. The plague incident in Cavaleem thus came to an end. After finishing his work here, Heath did not stay any longer. After resting for a day, he set off the next day and returned to the Shadow Tower. A few days later, outside the Shadow Land, in the woods. Walking on the path to the Shadow Land, Heath turned his head to look at the surrounding scenery. There was a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. The thick grass that grew past his knees, the ancient trees that blotted out the sky, the thick fallen leaves that filled the entire path, and the beams of light that interweaved in the air through the treetops. Everything was so familiar. Ender chuckled and said, "Hey, buddy, how is it? Do you still remember this path?" Heath replied, "Of course. Back then, he had walked through this road. He, Ender, Karina, and the wizard Salado who had led the way." Ender said with some emotion, "I didn't expect so many years to pass in the blink of an eye. The little unknown apprentice of the past has also become a wizard." Jessica smiled. "What? Are you two going to leave us to catch up?" Ender said, "We're just talking about the fact that we just came to the wizard world, okay? Heath and I come from the same place. I remember I told you about it, right?" Jenny interrupted and suggested, "Let's get together when we get back to the tower." After a pause, she said with some sadness, "After all, there aren't many apprentices left now." On the way, Heath had heard Jessica and the others talking about what had happened in the past few years. Because of the lack of resources, most of the apprentices had left the Shadowland in the past few years, including most of their first batch of apprentices. They were basically the only ones left. Jessica said, "I don't have any objections, but it depends on whether the wizard is willing to give us the honor." Heath asked, "Is the green bamboo hut still there?" Ender said, "This one is still there. That kid Kata hasn't died yet." Heath said, "Then let's meet there later. It's my treat." Everyone was overjoyed. As expected of our Shadow Tower's black-haired prince. "You can wear a crown just because you have a free meal? Your loyalty is too low. Haha." Everyone chatted merrily as they walked into the Shadowland. "Then, I'll see you later." "Okay." After parting ways in front of the main tower, Heath walked into the tower alone. 10 years ago, although the tower had been severely damaged and almost destroyed, it had been repaired with the help of magic. After 10 years of repair, Shadow Tower had mostly recovered. It was still as tall as the clouds, and it was still as magnificent as ever. However, there were fewer apprentices in the tower. The tower that used to be bustling with people had become much quieter. Along the way, Heath only saw a few apprentices. According to Ender and the others, there were less than 100 apprentices left in the tower now. Heath looked at the tower. Although it looked exactly the same as before, he still felt that it was a little different. It was probably due to its temperament. In the past, due to the dark clouds that covered the tower all day long, Shadow Tower was very depressing and dull. Wherever it went, it would be dark. But now that the dark clouds had disappeared, the sunlight shone directly on the tower, lighting up the entire tower. The cold temperament was replaced by warmth. The temperament of the tower had changed, and so had the apprentices. In the past, there were too many apprentices in the tower. In addition to the shortage of resources, the internal volume of the tower was very serious. Competition, hard work, struggle, hard work. In order to not lag behind, in order to snatch the resources, the apprentices almost always opened their eyes and worked until night. Occasionally, they would relax and constantly worry about their cultivation progress. Heath was a typical example, and he was the representative figure among them. No matter where he went, he could always see the apprentices' hurried footsteps in the past. He could see the anxiety and urgency on their faces all the time. But now, along the way, the apprentices that Heath saw were not in a hurry. There was not much anxiety on their faces. They strolled leisurely in the courtyard, looking peaceful. Are they lying down and waiting to die? Heath was amazed. When they passed through a corridor, a familiar figure slowly walked over from the other end of the corridor. That was a witch. A beautiful witch. That beautiful face that even magic could not bring, silver-grey silky long hair, fair and delicate skin as white as snow, and a black cloak wrapped around her whole body. Thud. Thud. The sound of footsteps stopped almost at the same time in the corridor. The young men and women on both sides of the corridor stopped at the same time. Heath looked at the witch in front of him, and the witch in front of him was also looking at him. The sunlight penetrated the cross window on one side of the corridor and interweaved into beams of light between the two of them. On this afternoon, the two people who had not seen each other for a long time welcomed their first meeting again. Chapter 181, Above. They looked at each other in silence for a while. Long time no see. The same voice sounded in the corridor. It was as if neither of them had expected the other. They were both stunned when the voice sounded. Shirley was stunned on the spot, a little at a loss. Heath walked over and greeted her with a smile. Long time no see. Shirley nodded and greeted him again, long time no see. After that, she stopped talking. As usual, the scene fell into an awkward silence. Shirley stared at him with her big eyes. Heath sighed. I knew it. Feeling speechless, he said, I came back to look for witch Cassandra. Shirley said, oh. Heath said, then, shall we part ways here? Shirley nodded. Yes. Heath walked forward, but Shirley was still standing in the same place. As if it was an illusion, he seemed to feel that she was a little depressed at the moment he passed by her. It was not until Heath walked out for a while that Shirley, who was half a beat full, continued to walk. Da-da-da-da. Da. Da-da-da. Two footsteps were heard again. One was straightforward, while the other seemed to be a little slow. After walking for a while, Heath seemed to have suddenly thought of something and suddenly stopped in his tracks. He turned his head and shouted to Shirley behind him, tonight, we will hold a banquet at the green bamboo hut. If you have time, come together. Shirley turned around with a puzzled look on her face. Heath thought she didn't understand, so he repeated, I said, we're having a party at the green bamboo hut tonight. Ender, Jessica, and the others are coming. If you have time, come with us. Shirley said, oh. Oh. She repeated it again and emphasized her ending. The two of them parted. Heath continued forward and came to the end of the long corridor in front of him. There was a big door with an oil painting hanging on it. In the painting, there was a fat middle-aged man wearing a jazz hat and a red button-down shirt. He looked like a court etiquette officer. He exuded a flamboyant temperament. Strangely, this painting was alive. At this moment, the fat middle-aged man inside was holding a small mirror and shining it back and forth. This was Ghost Glennie. It was said that he used to be a noble of the 16 kingdoms at the edge of the forest. A wizard from the Shadow Tower went on a trip and he offended that wizard. Therefore, he was made into a ghost and put in a photo frame to manage the door. Heath walked over and said, I'm here to see witch Cassandra. On the wall, Glennie was still looking at the mirror and said indifferently, do you have an appointment? Heath said, no, tell her for me. Before he finished his words, Glennie snorted lightly and interrupted him with disdain, no appointment? If you don't have an appointment, why are you telling me about your grandmother's false teeth? The wizard master has such a noble identity. How can a nobody like you meet her just because you want to? Heath frowned. He suddenly understood why this guy was hung on the wall. He did not say any nonsense and just released a little of the wizard power that he had deliberately concealed. Wizard. How powerful was that energy? Even if it was just a little, it was still abnormally terrifying. Glennie immediately felt a powerful spiritual force sweeping towards him like a tsunami. Clang! The small mirror in Glennie's hand dropped to the ground in fright. He put his 5 fingers into his mouth and said with a trembling voice, Wizard! Wizard! Oh! My God! Wizard! He was shivering in the painting, lowering his head to the ground and begging repeatedly, Wizard, Glennie knows he's wrong. Glennie is a bastard. Please spare Glennie, Glennie won't dare to do it again. Was he so cowardly? Seeing how interesting he was, Heath couldn't help but want to tease him. But before he could do it, a voice sounded. All right, you're already a wizard, yet you're still making things difficult for a ghost. Don't you think it's beneath you? Heath immediately restrained himself. The voice continued, Glennie, let him in. The ghost Glennie felt as if he had been granted amnesty. He hurriedly said, Yes, I'll follow your orders, the Supreme Wizard Master. This lord, please come in. With a creak, the closed door finally opened to both sides. After passing through the door, Heath came to a strange space. At this moment, he was on a platform. In front of him was the center of the tower, and above it was the Wizard Master's room. However, this place was hollow. There were no stairs, no corridors, and nothing at all. Moreover, there was a spell that forbade flying here. Once he entered this place, Heath felt that the flight runes were suppressed by some kind of power. There were no stairs and he couldn't fly, so how could he go up? Clack, clack, clack. Just as Heath was surprised, the sound of wings flapping suddenly sounded from the horizon. Then, he saw pieces of strange stone slabs flying up. The appearance of these stone slabs was not much different from ordinary stone slabs. The strange thing was that they all had a pair of small wings, and there were mouths on the stone slabs. The flying slates lined up in a long line and overlapped in front of Heath, forming a spiral staircase. Step on me! Step on me! Step on me! The slates let out cheerful shouts and warmly beckoned Heath to go up. Heath did not stand on ceremony and immediately stepped on it. After he stepped on the slates, these slates once again flapped their small wings rapidly. At the same time, the entire spiral staircase began to spin rapidly, bringing Heath along as it quickly zigzagged upwards. In a short moment, Heath had already reached the top floor. There was also a platform here, so he immediately walked up. See you! See you! See you! The stone slabs once again let out waves of shouts, and then they flapped their tiny wings and scattered. Heath turned around to take a look. Is this a flying stone slab? It was created by an ancient wizard. So there really is such a strange creature. This was the first time he had seen such a stone slab. Then, he continued walking forward. There was only a very long corridor in front, and on both sides of the corridor stood metal armor. It looked like an ordinary castle decoration, but Heath knew that it wasn't. These were genuine alchemy puppets, and each of them had extremely strong combat power. When gathered together, even a wizard like him would feel a chill down his spine. Heath couldn't help but feel a little apprehensive. Such a colossus, were they really defeated just because of a 3-ring scroll? As his thoughts ran wild, he walked through the corridor. At the end of the corridor was a huge door. On one side of the door hung a stone tablet with the words Wizard Master's Room written on it. When Heath came to the door creaked and opened on both sides. Chapter 182, Old History. The room inside was very spacious, but the furnishings were very simple. There was a wooden table, a wooden wardrobe, and a beauty mirror. There was basically nothing else. The wooden table was placed in the innermost part of the room. There was a cage on the table, and there was an owl inside. At this time, with Cassandra was in front of the cage. There were some mouse pups on the wooden plate beside her. The old witch was holding these pups and surrounding the owl. Eat, eat, eat more. Heath gently knocked on the door next to him, making a knock, knock, knock sound. The old witch poured all the mouse pups on the plate into the cage. Then, she raised her head and waved at Heath. Little guy, come over. Heath walked over and bowed. Long time no see, teacher Cassandra. Cassandra smiled and said, not too long. It's just 10 years. In the time dimension of a wizard, this is no different from yesterday. You'll get used to it slowly. Obviously, Cassandra already knew about his advancement to a wizard. Heath said, thank you for your advice. Cassandra waved her hand and said, it's far from that. After a pause, she looked up and down at Heath and said in surprise, from the day you entered Shadow Tower, I felt that you were different from other children, but your performance still surprised me. I have to say, you are really a little guy who can create miracles. I'm starting to look forward to where you will go in the future. Heath said humbly and half seriously, luck. Which Cassandra shook her head. Luck is reserved for those who are brave enough to fight. If it were someone else, even if they found the wizard's water in the magic bug forest, they would not have the ability and courage to take it in their hands. You're able to achieve your current achievements mainly because of yourself. Heath's expression was a little awkward. After all, the magic bug forest was the wizard's treasure vault of Shadow Tower. Strictly speaking, he was a thief. She probably saw the strange expression on Heath's face. Which Cassandra said casually, there's no right or wrong in the chaotic era. Since you can find them and take them, they belong to you. There's no need to feel burdened by it. Heath had already advanced to a wizard. It was better to be generous and let the matter go. A mere 10 million magic stones was not a huge number for Shadow Tower. Hearing Cassandra's words, Heath's eyebrows relaxed. Although he did not care, it was better to be recognized. He nodded. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Cassandra shook her head and pointed to the chair opposite her. All right, sit down. Let's stop the small talk. Let's talk about business first. You've read the letter. Do you have any questions? Heath sat down and asked, this is also what I don't understand. This bloody battlefield. I hope you can explain it to me. Expected question. Which Cassandra nodded. Then she opened the drawer and took out a wooden box. When she opened the box, there was some colorful sand inside. She grabbed a handful of sand on the table and gently blew on the sand. Whoosh! Whoosh! A gust of wind swept towards the wooden table and rolled up the sand, which then spread to the four sides of the table like smoke. Then, pictures appeared on the table. First, there was a very lush primitive forest. There were all kinds of animals living in the forest, as well as intelligent and sub-intelligent species such as snakes, ravens, green goblins, and so on. There were even delicate-looking creatures with pointy ears. Heath was stunned. Elves. These were the elves of the forest clan, who were said to have died out. It was said that they were the former rulers of the forest clan. Which Cassandra nodded and said, yes, elves. Then, she began to explain. A long time ago, the Underdark Tresia and even the entire western continent were the territories of the forest clan. The elves were the rulers here. As she spoke, she continued to knock on the table. The sand flowed and soon, there were new changes. This time, it was a huge humanoid monster. It had human-like facial features and 4 limbs. It also stood on 2 legs, but there was a pair of goat-like black horns on its head. Its muscles were very warped, its skin was red, and what was even more strange was that its entire body was dyed in red flames. It looked extremely imposing. Heath recognized the monster's identity. This is Everett. He had read in a book that it was said to be one of the 16 gods that ruled the ancient wizard world, the Balrog Everett from the plane of hell. Which Cassandra continued, yes. Later, Everett from hell came here and brought the thousands of creatures it enslaved, including humans. She gently waved her hand, and thousands of soldiers and horses with shackles appeared around Everett. They brought slaughter and destruction. In Cassandra's story, the forest on the table also burned up. Thousands of forest people were massacred, with piles of bones and corpses everywhere, as if it was the end of the world. At this time of despair, a group of unusual humans mastered the power to control elements. In the picture, some humans appeared. They were holding flames, or wrapped in frost and lightning. They were doing some very basic magic. Cassandra said, these are the first wizards. She continued, the wizards with power were not willing to be forever enslaved by Everett, so they formed an alliance with the forest people and launched a counterattack against Everett together. A beautiful garden-like palace appeared on the screen. The humans and elves shook hands. After that was a series of war scenes. War, blood, and bones. The wizards and the forest race continued to attack Everett. At the end of the scene, Everett's huge body fell to the ground. Cassandra said, we successfully destroyed Everett, but before we could be happy, something terrible happened. At that time, we knew that the war was far from over. As she spoke, black mist suddenly emerged from Everett's body. The mist transformed into terrifying faces in the air, like devils. Cassandra asked, when you were an apprentice, I heard that you were knowledgeable. There were even rumors that your knowledge accumulation was no less than that of a wizard. Can you tell what the black mist is? Heath stared at the black mist for a while and asked uncertainly, wraiths. Souls should enter the cycle of reincarnation after the death of their bodies. However, some souls were preserved for many reasons and became ghosts. Among them, some of the ghosts became wraiths because their hearts were distorted by great resentment. Cassandra nodded. The rumors are true. Heath was surprised. Are these really wraith? That's too exaggerated. Wraiths were a combination of distortion, madness, and terror. What was worse was that these things had terrible contamination. Once they were contaminated, they could easily cause people to go crazy. The famous Dark Wizard region was mostly formed because of the contamination of wraiths. That was why the wizards there were so abnormal and crazy. Heath asked with a strange expression, but why don't we feel affected? A wraith formed by the soul of a god after death. The surging energy was definitely enough to pollute the entire west coast. Which Cassandra said, that's because the ancient wizards sealed it. Sealed? Heath thought for a moment and suddenly thought of something. Dimensional space. Which Cassandra smiled and said, you are indeed very smart. She nodded. Yes, after sensing the release of the wraith from Everett's corpse, the ancient wizards joined hands to send it into a dimensional space and sealed it there. After a pause, she continued, and this is also the origin of the bloody battlefield. Then, Heath finally learned what the so-called bloody battlefield was from the witch. Chapter 183, Decision. According to Witch Cassandra, although the wizards sealed the body of Everett into the dimensional space, there were too many wraiths. The dimensional rift alone could not contain so much wraith energy. Once the compressed wraith energy broke through the dimensional space, the entire western continent would become a living hell. Therefore, every once in a while, the wizards of the western continent would organize a group of wizards to enter the dimensional space to clean up the wraiths inside. Cleaning up the wraiths is the responsibility of every wizard of the west coast. No matter what identity or where you come from, as long as you are selected, you must unconditionally shoulder this responsibility. After listening to Cassandra's description, Heath could not help but ask, why did they choose me? Cassandra did not go into detail on this issue. She simply explained, because the Tower of Order thinks that you are outstanding enough. You are a warrior suitable to clear out the wraiths. Heath frowned. Something like wraiths was definitely not an easy task. Simply put, the negative energy particles of a wraith were extremely powerful. Even a wraith formed by an ordinary person could pose a certain threat to a wizard. From this, it could be seen how difficult this thing was to deal with. And a wraith formed by the soul of an ancient god. The level of such energy was unimaginable to Heath. For a moment, his expression could not help but become gloomy and uncertain. Perhaps seeing through Heath's thoughts, which Cassandra said, don't think about running away. Deserters will not have a good ending no matter where they go. Even if you make up your mind to run to the Dark Wizard region, it may not be completely safe. Heath said a little awkwardly, ahem, you're thinking too much. I have no intention in that regard. Which Cassandra said, that's for the best. After a pause, she suddenly said, that way, I think you can choose a better cemetery for yourself in advance. Heath was stunned. Which Cassandra asked, do you know where the name Bloody came from in the bloody battlefield? Heath shook his head. Cassandra explained, from the beginning of the dimensional space's seal, every time a warrior was selected to enter the rift to clean up the wraiths, there would be a great number of casualties. Even at the best of times, the casualty rate will not be less than 60%. In most cases, it's already very lucky for 1 out of 10 warriors who entered the rift to be able to come back. Heath. Which Cassandra laughed and said, how is it? Do you need my advice? I have some research on feng shui and luck. I can let you reincarnate in your next life. Heath's mouth twitched. If this was really what Cassandra said, then why would he go to the bloody battlefield? Even if he abandoned everything and went to the Dark Wizard region to become a Dark Wizard, he would not go. After thinking for a while, he asked, Teacher Cassandra, since you're willing to tell me so much, I think you're not just trying to make a fool out of me. Cassandra nodded. Then, she opened the drawer and took out an item. It was a rag doll that looked like it had been around for many years. It was tattered and looked no different from an ordinary rag doll. However, Heath could feel that there was an unusual surge of soul energy on it. Which Cassandra said, this is a substitute doll. It's a special witchcraft tool made by ancient wizards. This craft has been lost for a long time. Its function is to preserve souls. As long as wizards bind their souls to it, even if their bodies are destroyed, they can use this substitute doll to be reborn. It can ensure that you can come back alive from the bloody battlefield. Pausing for a moment, she took out a small bottle, which contained a red liquid. She explained, in addition, this is a bottle of soul mutation potion. I think you have heard of this before, and you will need it in the future. When a wizard entered the intermediate and later stages, they would begin to undergo mutation of the soul. Only after the soul was completely mutated could they advance to become an intermediate level wizard. Heath looked surprised. The value of these two things was needless to say. The soul mutation potion was an indispensable and rare treasure for every wizard. Its value was equivalent to the wizard's water of an apprentice. As for that doll, it was even more so. It was equivalent to giving a wizard an extra life. He said with a strange expression, "This is for me." Which Cassandra nodded and said, "Don't be surprised. You deserve it. Although the bloody battlefield is fraught with risks, there are countless opportunities. Outstanding performance can bring a generous reward, a reward for the warrior himself, and a reward for the wizard territory the warrior belongs to. It's rare for our Underdark Tresia to have such an outstanding genius like you. I was looking forward to you fighting for resources for our Underdark Tresia on the battlefield." Heath was enlightened. Which Cassandra continued to ask, "Do you have any other requests?" Heath thought for a moment and said, "I haven't told you yet. I've already joined the Church of Light, and..." Cassandra knew what Heath was referring to. Shadow Tower had spies all over the Underdark Tresia. It was not something that a third circle spell could eradicate. She knew exactly what was happening outside. She nodded. "As the Wizard Master of Shadow Tower and the ruler of the Underdark Tresia, I promise you that everything that the Church of Light has now will be legalized. Also, in the future, the Underdark Tresia will give you a land of resources that will satisfy you." "How refreshing!" Heath said righteously, "To be able to fight for the Underdark Tresia is the greatest honor of my life as a wizard." The matter was thus decided. After all, Heath did not have a better choice. Escape to another place? Not to mention what he would do in the Underdark Tresia's territory, even if he chose to escape, where could he escape to? The Tower of Order and the ruler of the Underdark had both issued a conscription order. There was only one outcome if he refused to accept the conscription, and that was to be beaten into a dark wizard. The wizard continent was one entity from the highest to the lowest. Once one was certified as a dark wizard, there would be no place for them in the 13 order wizard realms of the wizard world. From then on, they could only go to places like the Dark Wizard region and the Forgotten Land. Their bright future would be destroyed in an instant. As for choosing to participate in the war, although it seemed extremely dangerous, as long as he had the substitute doll given to him by Witch Cassandra, he would be able to escape unscathed no matter what. For a wizard, as long as they could protect his soul, the rest would be a small problem. Not to mention that his territory could be smoothly legalized, and he could even have a resource land, from which he could obtain a stable source of income. One had to know that in the past 10 years, the Church of Light had contributed many magic stone materials to Heath every year. Did Shadow Tower still have the right to do so? If it was before, Heath would have been suspicious as well. But after this incident, Heath felt that after all the chaos in the Underdark Tresia, there was only one outcome. Not to mention other things, just the alchemy puppets outside the Wizard Master's room were not something that many wizard organizations could bring out in the Underdark Tresia. Strength, in addition to the certification of the Tower of Order, the ruler of the Underdark probably only had one name in the end. In short, the matter was decided. After leaving the Wizard Master's room, Heath followed the agreement and went to the green bamboo hut for the appointment. Chapter 184, The Banquet. Heath, the black-haired guy from Forgotten issue 168, has advanced to a wizard. Ah! Is this for real? It's true. Today, he came to Shadow Tower. As a wizard, he even invited his fellow apprentices to have dinner at the green bamboo hut. Pervert. Although I knew that this guy was very fierce, this is too perverted. It seemed that no matter which world he was in, an academy could not hide any secrets. In just a short afternoon, Heath's advancement to a wizard had successfully transformed the entire Shadow Tower. By the time Heath arrived at the green bamboo hut, the apprentices who came to see him had already filled the entire restaurant. Seeing that Heath was not stingy, he took out a bag of magic stones and threw it to the green goblin in the restaurant. He said very casually, "Everyone who comes is a guest. All the expenses today are on my head." Cheers resounded. Heath. Heath. You are the greatest wizard I have ever seen. Eternal God. The news was like a letter that had grown wings. It was quickly spread. In less than half an hour, nearly 100 apprentices had gathered at the green bamboo hut. At present, almost all the apprentices in Shadow Tower had come. Even the owner of the restaurant, Kata, could not help but sigh. I've never seen the green bamboo hut so lively. The upper and lower floors of the restaurant were full of apprentices. The restaurant had to add more than 10 tables to the outside of the room at the last minute. The ordinary dinner was turned into a banquet. No matter what, Shadow Tower was the guide on the path of wizards. Now that it had become rich, it would not be a problem to give the apprentices an official wizard tool, let alone a meal. During the banquet, Heath became the main character. The apprentices surrounded Heath in 3 layers, and all kinds of voices were heard. There were also people who knew about Heath's return and asked him about the bloody battlefield, such as Daniel. Daniel, who came from the Darth family, was the only official apprentice at the banquet. He was invited to the banquet purely because of his friendship with Heath. At the banquet, he brought up this matter. Heath, I heard that you accepted the recruitment to the bloody battlefield. Is this true? An apprentice who did not know the truth asked, the bloody battlefield? What is the bloody battlefield? Daniel explained it in detail. And from his words, the news about the bloody battlefield quickly spread. Ah? What? There's such a place. So our taxes and resources are closely related to this war. Wizard Heath, you have to work hard. In fact, the bloody battlefield was not a secret. The reason why everyone knew so little was because it was too long. Once every 100 years, many apprentices who knew about it would die before they could live that long. In addition, the performance of the recruited wizards of the Underdark Tresia on the bloody battlefield had always been poor, so the Underdark Tresia rarely publicized it. As time went by, very few people knew about it. However, as the bloody battlefield approached, some necessary publicity would be spread. Daniel's explanation was so detailed that it must have been ordered by the wizards. Daniel said, my family will also participate in this war. I'll write you a recommendation letter later and see if I can arrange for you to work under my family. Heath's eyes lit up. Ah? Really? If that's the case, that would be the best. I'm really grateful. The Darth family was similar to Magnus. They were relatively famous wizard families in the West Coast and were ranked within the top 10. If they could have the support of such a family, they would definitely gain a lot of benefits. The banquet continued until the end. Soul-washing wine, burp. Again, give me another cup. Wine, give me wine. Oh, are there any wizards playing cards together tonight? My 2 sisters and I are free tonight. I am free. Those who went back to their rooms went back to their rooms. Those who went to sleep went back to sleep. Those who went to sleep by themselves. Anyway, back to our homes, back to our mothers. Heath also left the dining room and walked to the dormitory that the tower had arranged for him. There is a lake on the way to the dormitory building. Now it was late at night, the moonlight poured down, reflecting the surface of the lake shimmering. Facing the moonlight, the moonflowers that only bloomed under the moon by the lake also opened their buds, absorbing the moonlight to their heart's content. The light was beautiful. Flap, flap, flap. The sound of wings flapping could be heard. The palm-sized flower goblin flew over and led the honey pot made of nutshells in its hand to collect the moonlight that was used to brew wine. After filling a small pot, it quickly flew towards the forest. Over there, thousands of fireflies were shuttling back and forth in the forest. The flashing lights illuminated the bright red lantern fruits, the curving vines, the mottled stone slabs, and the crystals on the trees. It was like a dream. The dreamlike magical scene in front of him caught Heath's attention. He could not help but stop for a moment and stop by the lakeside to admire it. Hoo! Hoo! The night wind blew, dissipating his little tipsy state. As long as a wizard did not want to, they would not get drunk. Da-da-da! Right at this moment, the sound of hurried footsteps could be heard by the lakeside. Heath turned his head, but could not help but be stunned. A figure walked over from the lakeside. It was an old acquaintance of Heath's, Shirley. She was in a hurry, rushing towards the green bamboo hut. When she saw Heath by the lakeside, she immediately stopped. Standing under the moonlight, their eyes met, and for a moment, they were speechless. After a moment, Shirley asked, "Is the banquet over?" Heath nodded. "Yes." Shirley said apologetically, "I'm sorry I'm late." Heath shook his head. "It's okay. It must be less important than business." While chatting with Jessica and the others at the banquet, Heath knew that Shirley was going to the Lost Track Forest to collect the singing calla lilies. It was the northernmost forest in Shadowland. It was a long journey. Shirley said, "Then, I'll take my leave first. After saying that, she lowered her head and turned around to leave. For some reason, Heath felt that her mood seemed to be a little down, and the slender figure walking alone in the night wind also looked a little bleak. At the banquet, Heath heard that her reputation was still not very good, and she was still not very popular. She was still a lonely existence. After some thought, Heath stopped her. Wait. Shirley turned around. Heath took out a bottle of wine and waved it in the air. I haven't had enough. Why don't the two of us find a place to have a drink? Shirley was a little hesitant. Actually, she was not very good at getting along with people, especially when they were alone. But before she could make up her mind, Heath suddenly flashed in front of her and appeared in front of her. Shirley was shocked. Instinctively, she shrank back and at the same time, black fog surged out of her body. She threw a dark curse at him. If they were hit, any other apprentice would definitely suffer, even if it was not fatal. However, in front of a wizard, it was child's play. Heath did not move. A gust of wind swept up from the ground and dispelled the black fog. He then reached out his hand and grabbed Shirley, pulling her into his arms. Heath smiled like a wizard and said, "Anyway, we are already familiar with each other. We should skip some of the complicated parts." Shirley was stunned. Heath did not say anything. He bent down, picked her up, and walked to the house. Thus, day after day. The next few days were like this. Half a month later, the bloody battlefield officially opened. Chapter 185, Sky. Half a month later, Heath set off for the bloody battlefield. In addition to him, the Underdark Trezia recruited more than 10 wizards and more than 300 intermediate and advanced apprentices. The human side recruited more than 2,000 people, of which more than 500 had the strength of an official knight. The rest of the apprentice knights were also outstanding in swordsmanship and combat strength. These people had come from the battlefield just now and basically included the most powerful candidates in the entire Underdark Trezia. There were close to 3,000 wizards, apprentices, knights, and apprentice knights. For this reason, the Tower of Order had specially arranged a fleet of more than 10 medium and large wizard ships to come and meet them. Unlike Heath's wizard ships that sailed on the sea, the wizard ships brought by the Tower of Order were equipped with propellers and airbags. They could float up to 10,000 meters in the air. This kind of wizard ship was also called an airship. More than 10 airships picked up more than 3,000 warriors who had received the warning signs and sailed in the direction of the bloody battlefield. A few days later, in a certain airspace in the east of the Underdark Trezia. Rumble. The loud roar of the propellers as they rotated echoed in the sky. Ships flew high in the sky. They either had large airbags or raised high white sails. Their appearances were all different, and they looked arrogant and domineering, like ferocious beasts flying in the sky. They pierced through layers and layers of thick clouds. In the middle of the fleet was a huge airship that was bigger than the rest of the airships. This was the mothership of this fleet, and it carried the summoned wizards. The ship had a total of 4 floors, and they were divided according to their strength and status. At this moment, in a cabin on the top floor. TSS. TSS. The sound of burning candles was softly heard in the cabin. On the wooden table, a white meditation candle was burning. The flames danced continuously and a large number of elements were released from it. There was a chair beside the table. At this moment, Heath was sitting on the chair and meditating with his eyes closed. Time passed slowly. Very soon, a meditation candle was also burnt out. Not long after, Heath opened his eyes. Phew! After losing his breath, he rubbed his slightly sore temples and took out a test crystal ball from his spatial pocket. Ever since the system had upgraded, Heath had cut off the connection with it. Later, in order to confirm his progress in his strength training, Heath had specially prepared a test crystal ball. He placed a medium-grade magic stone on it, which was used to test the strength of a wizard. Heath then placed a hand on the crystal ball. As the magic stone's energy was released, the magic array placed on the crystal ball was activated. A cloud of smoke rose from the crystal ball, and a row of numbers quickly appeared. 162. 162.36. This was Heath's current spiritual force value. According to the classification of a wizard's spiritual force, when one's spiritual force exceeded 150, it meant that they had entered the intermediate stage of the wizard. The goal set 10 years ago could be considered to have been accomplished smoothly. This efficiency was definitely not considered slow, but it was also the result of the accumulation of a huge amount of resources. In the past 10 years, the batch of resources he had obtained in the magic bug forest had basically all been used up by him. This was not even counting the resources that Paul and the others had sent over. The cost of training as a wizard was too high. Heath sighed. I don't know when this training will end. Not to mention the huge consumption of resources, the crucial point was that the speed of advancement was extremely slow. Especially after entering the intermediate stage, Heath could clearly feel that his training speed had plummeted. In the past month, he could at least increase 1 or 2 points of spiritual force, but now, it was unlikely that he could increase that much in half a year. And this was only the intermediate stage of the wizard realm. What kind of training efficiency would the advanced stage of the wizard realm have? It was simply unimaginable. By the way, the system upgrade should be over, right? Only after losing it did he realize how valuable it was to have it. Looking at the rate at which his spiritual force was increasing every day, Heath could not help but miss the time when the system had accompanied him. The opportunity is only for those who are prepared. No matter if there is a system or not, do what you should do first. Shaking his head, Heath dismissed these messy thoughts. Then, he put away the testing crystal ball and took out a bottle of magic potion from his dimensional pocket. Inside the bottle, there was a red liquid that looked like blood. Soul Mutation Potion. Heath looked at the Soul Mutation Potion in his hand in high spirits. This was basically the biggest harvest of his trip. After wizards reached the intermediate and advanced stages, they had to start the mutation of the soul. Only after the soul had completed the mutation could they advance to an intermediate wizard. And the Soul Mutation Potion was an essential item for wizards to open the mutation of the soul. Shadow Tower is really generous. Are they trying to rope me in? A bottle of Soul Mutation Potion was worth at least 200 to 300 high-level magic stones, which was 2 to 3 million magic stones. Heath didn't think that it was just to appease him to accept the recruitment. But it was a good thing. If Shadow Tower could really regain power, Heath, who was the first to express his loyalty, believed that he would get a lot of benefits. I'll rest for 2 days to adjust my condition and start the mutation. After making a decision, Heath immediately got up and left the cabin, deciding to go out for some fresh air. Soon, he arrived at the top deck. The structure of the mothership was a ladder-like structure. There were 2 floors on the deck, the top deck and the lower deck. The top deck was specially used for the guests in the top deck cabin. They were wizards and some pure-blooded people from high-level wizard families. There were only a few dozen of them. The rest of the lower deck was used by ordinary apprentices. Seeing Heath coming out of the cabin, a beautiful female apprentice immediately came up to him and bowed respectfully. "Wizard, is there anything I can do for you?" The Tower of Order had prepared a maid for each wizard to take care of the wizard's food and living. If needed, they could also provide them with physiological needs. Heath said, "Get me something to drink and food." "Yes." The maid went down. Heath came to an empty dining table beside the fence and pulled out a chair to sit down. Soon, the maid came back with a cup of hot cocoa, empty whale meat, flying jellyfish and other specialties that only existed in the air. While eating snacks and drinking cocoa, Heath enjoyed the scenery around him. His field of vision was wide enough to see everything around him. On the deck below, the apprentices who came to enjoy the scenery gathered by the fence and pointed at the wonderful creatures high in the sky. Unlike the quiet sky of the Blue Star, the sky of the wizard world was very lively. There were flat but translucent skyfish like devilfish, flying jellyfish like jellyfish umbrella-shaped, air whales like whales with big airbags, and even flying fish with wings that grew an inch long, and so on. These were all creatures that lived 10,000 meters above the ground, also known as atmospheric creatures. Their physiological structure was very special, and they would not fall to the ground. From birth to death, they floated in the air. Small atmospheric creatures ate clouds, while the larger ones ate the smaller ones and were devoured by the larger ones. The largest ones disintegrated into the food of small atmospheric creatures and disintegrated into elements after death. The most up-to-date novels are published on Fruit.no. The bigger fish ate the smaller fish, and the smaller ones ate the shrimps. A complete ecological chain was formed just like that. There were many strange creatures like this. The flying stone slab that Heath had stepped on was also a kind of aerial creature, and there were stones that could float in the sky. Wizards even used this to build a floating city in the sky. "Heath!" At this moment, a shout suddenly came from behind. Heath turned his head and saw several figures coming from the other side. Chapter 186, Mutation. There were a total of 3 people walking over. They were 2 men and a woman. Although they looked young, judging from their temperament, they were not young anymore. The three of them were the apprentices recruited by the Underdark Tresia. The man and the woman were Marlowe and Bertha from the Twisted Hut, and the slightly younger man was Cain, who came from Shadow Tower, just like Heath. The three of them came to the dining table and bowed. Bertha said, "Wizard Heath, are you coming out to get some fresh air?" Heath nodded and then casually invited, "Yes, it's too stuffy in the cabin. If you don't have anything to do, why don't you sit down and have a drink?" The three of them didn't refuse and sat down. The top deck cabin was the gathering place for purebloods. The four of them were the only muggles here, so they were much more friendly. The female apprentice soon brought a few cups of hot cocoa. Marlowe picked up the cocoa and took a sip. He sighed and said, "When I was an apprentice, I liked this type of cocoa the most. I lived frugally for a month before I dared to drink a cup. At that time, I thought that if I became a wizard one day, I would definitely drink a cup every day." Heath smiled and said, "Then, your wish has been fulfilled." Marlowe had been a famous high-level apprentice in the Underdark Tresia for many years. He was just short of a portion of wizard's water. After accepting the recruitment, he finally obtained this portion of wizard's water, and successfully advanced to a wizard. Marlowe smiled bitterly and said, "Yes, the prerequisite is to be able to return alive." It was not an exaggeration for an official rank wizard to talk about life and death. During this period of time, Heath had also inquired about many things related to the bloody battlefield. How should he put it? It could only be said that the words that which Cassandra said in Shadow Tower were really not to scare him. Which Bertha frowned and said, "It's better to say less curses. No matter what, as wizards, we can't be worse than ordinary apprentices, right?" Like Marlowe, she was also a wizard who had just advanced. Cain was the only apprentice among them. However, he had reached the peak level and was not far from advancing. He was also favored by the Hylary family, so he was able to live on the top floor. He was also the only Muggle apprentice on the top floor. Cain agreed. Which Bertha is right. If we don't have confidence in ourselves, how can we get good results on the battlefield? I'm still hoping to gain the recognition of the wizard families. The bloody battlefield was a crisis, but it was also an opportunity. If they performed well on the battlefield, they could be recruited by some wizard families or even marry their children, and become one of the pure bloods. After a pause, he suddenly said, "Wizard Heath, we've decided to establish an offensive and defensive alliance. Do you want to join?" Heath asked in confusion, "Offensive and defensive alliance?" Cain nodded and looked back. Then, he whispered, "We are only muggles. Once we get to the battlefield, it's hard to guarantee that there won't be any unfair treatment. If we take care of each other, we can also reduce the unfairness. In case someone cowers in fear, we have decided to sign an agreement. We will advance and retreat together, and share resources. How about it?" Heath shook his head. "We can take care of each other, but let's forget about signing an agreement." Such an agreement had pros and cons. It was not something that could be casually signed. The three looked at each other. Marlowe said, "Wizard Heath, are you sure? Fighting alone is not a good idea." Bertha also said, "Yes, Wizard Heath, are you sure you don't want to reconsider?" Heath shook his head. "I'm sorry, the three of you." The three of them frowned. It was obvious that they had come to find Heath for this matter. After being rejected by Heath, everyone's emotions were a little strange, and the atmosphere became a little awkward. Seeing this, Heath stood up and said, "I'm going to take a walk over there." "Excuse me." After saying that, he went to the side alone. After Heath left, the three of them no longer hid their serious expressions. Marlowe said angrily, "He's too arrogant. Does he think that advancing to a wizard is that big of a deal?" Bertha said sarcastically, "After all, he's a genius." Marlowe said disdainfully, "Genius? That's just placed among a bunch of muggles. If he's a pure blood, he's nothing at all. If he wants to fight alone on the battlefield, I don't even know how he'll die." Cain said, forget it. We all have our own aspirations. We can't force others to come. Let's continue to talk about the agreement." A few days later, in the cabin, in the training room. In the spacious training room, Heath was busy in the middle of the training room, holding a runic brush and beast blood. On the floor, a complicated hexagram magic array had been drawn with beast blood. Around the magic array were white candles, bone powder, magic stones, and other miscellaneous items. This was a support magic array for mutating souls. After the magic array was completely set up, Heath came to the center of the magic array and gently clapped his hands. Bang! The white candles around the magic array burned together, and the magic stones placed around the magic array melted one by one. The elemental particles that they melted poured into the magic array like water and began to spread in all directions, lighting up the entire magic array. Heath immediately sat down cross-legged, took out the soul mutation potion, pulled out the bottle stopper, and drank it. As soon as the potion entered his mouth, Heath immediately felt a chill that penetrated through his heart, through his nerve fibers and into his spiritual sea. The entire spiritual sea felt as if it had fallen into an ice cellar. Heath quickly closed his eyes and settled his consciousness into his spiritual sea. At this moment, a mass of blue translucent energy had appeared in his sea of consciousness. He could vaguely see that the energy had the outline of a human, and its facial features were somewhat similar to Heath's. This was Heath's soul. The cold energy brought by the soul mutation potion quickly spread along the nerve fibers and turned into countless slender tentacles that pierced into his soul. As these tentacles pierced into his soul, Heath's soul began to become abnormal. The most intuitive aspect was the color. Previously, his soul was blue, but after this mutation energy was injected, Heath's soul began to turn white, as if he was pouring milk into a pool of clear water. The white energy that was injected into Heath's chest quickly gathered, as if it wanted to occupy this place. However, Heath's soul instinctively repelled them. The soul energy began to tremble rapidly, trying to expel the white energy. Heath hurriedly controlled his spiritual energy to control his soul energy so that the soul energy would not resist. Then, he guided the white energy into his chest bit by bit. This continued for a while. Finally, the white energy gathered to Heath's chest without leaking a single bit, stabilizing itself there. Phew! Heath heaved a sigh of relief. It worked. But it was not a complete success. The soul mutation potion could only help a wizard plant a seed of the mutated soul in his soul. To spread the seed throughout his body would require years of hard work and a large number of materials. It was not something that could be completed in a day. The fleet headed east. After sailing for more than 2 months, they successfully arrived at their destination. Chapter 187, Tree City. The location of the bloody battlefield was the famous Dark Forest in the wizard world. To be exact, the reason why the Dark Forest was formed was because of the bloody battlefield. 3 months later, in the Dark Forest, in the bloody fortress, at the airship dock. Rumble. The loud sound of the propeller was heard one after another, and large airships entered the airport one after another. Yay! Yay! The soldiers of Shadowland have arrived. Yay! Yay! The soldiers of Shadowland have arrived. A hoarse hissing sound that sounded like a leaky pipe was heard. 2 crows howled and flew into the sky. The airships soon came to a stop. Kade! A sound was heard. The cabin door opened. The bridge plank stretched out from the inside and connected to the dock. Then, the 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers who had been recruited walked out of the cabin door one after another. Standing on the deck, Heath looked at the surrounding environment. This was a very strange and magical city. The theme structure of the city was trees. Huge trees, which were hundreds, thousands, or even thousands of meters tall, stood everywhere. Holes were dug out from the trunks of the trees to build houses, streets, and other buildings. The trees were connected by white stone bridges. A small boat made of large flowers and leaves floated in the air, carrying guests back and forth. In the center of the city was an unusually huge tree. The trees blotted out the sky and the sun, and the umbrellas spread out from the branches and leaves covered most of the city. This magnificent scenery immediately caught Heath's sight, and he could not help but stop for a while. How is it? Is it very spectacular? At this moment, a voice sounded. At some point, a man in his 40s stood beside him. He was wearing a cloak from the Tower of Order. When did this appear? Why don't I feel anything at all? Heath was slightly shocked. He nodded and said, "It's rare to see a species like this in the Dark Forest." The man looked at the tree and agreed, "Yes, after all, this is the core of the ancient forest. Shadowland is too remote." After a pause, he turned around and suddenly asked, "Do you know the name of this tree?" Heath looked at the man with a strange look. But he still carefully observed the tree and then answered, "Could it be the Tree of Life?" The Tree of Life was one of the oldest species in the wizard world. It was said that this tree would bear a special fruit. When the fruit matured, it would give birth to some human-like sharp-eared beautiful creatures, namely elves. A smile appeared on the man's face. Cassandra's letter to me said that you are very knowledgeable, and you are indeed unique. He raised a hand and patted Heath's shoulder. Heath subconsciously wanted to dodge, but for some reason, the man's hand still accurately patted Heath's shoulder. This scene could not help but shock him. After all, he was now a wizard and a grand knight. However, when he deliberately dodged, the other party still easily patted him. The man said, "I'm looking forward to your performance on the bloody battlefield." After saying that, the man moved to the side. 1 step. 2 steps. 3 steps. It was like teleportation. Each step was further and further away. After 3 steps, he disappeared. Heath was amazed. "What are you daydreaming about, Heath?" "Go quickly," Cain shouted at Heath. Heath turned around. "Do you know who that man was?" Cain asked in confusion. "Man? What man?" Heath pointed to the other side and said, "The man who was standing next to me just now. He was wearing the cloak of the Tower of Order." Cain looked suspicious. "Are you kidding me? You've always been alone. Where did this man come from?" Heath was stunned. "There's always someone better. In this world. Wizards are nothing. Let's go." After leaving the dock, the Tower of Order arranged for Heath and the others to board the small boat that floated among the big trees. The small boat could hold about 10 people. They took the small boat and flew toward the ancient Tree of Life in the center of the city. Finally, they landed at the bottom of the ancient Tree of Life. There was a huge tree hole with a diameter of more than 1,000 meters. The team stopped in front of the tree hole. Heath sized up the tree hole in front of him. From this tree hole, he could clearly feel an abnormally surging spatial energy. Moreover, he could feel the strengthened seal on this spatial energy. Obviously, this should be the entrance to the dimensional space. Wah! Pointy, pointy ears, pointy ears. So beautiful. Is this the elves? At this moment, there was an uproar from the crowd. Everyone's attention was focused in one direction. They saw a group of strange-looking people walking over. They looked exactly like humans, but each of them had extremely exquisite looks. What was even more unique was that each of them had a pair of pointy and long ears. There were about 10 people in this group. Walking on the outside was a man wearing golden armor and holding a cross sword. Their armor was slightly different from human armor. It was slightly longer and had hollow patterns on it. It was as exquisite as a piece of handicraft. Walking in the middle were more than 10 people wearing robes. This was a kind of ancient white robe. The sleeves of the robe were embroidered with leaf-shaped patterns with golden and green silk threads. Although it was just an ordinary walk, every one of them had a sense of elegance as they walked. "Are these the elves?" Heath, who had seen this strange creature for the first time, could not help but take a second look. They were one of the oldest species in the world, and it was even rumored that they were the masters of this world in the past. The elves came to the tree hole and spread out on both sides. The elves in robes raised their hands toward the tree hole, and a leaf-like pattern suddenly lit up in their palms, emitting an emerald green light. It was said that many elves were born with the ability to use magic, just like the talent of demonized beasts. There were even rumors that wizards' magic originated from elves. This faint green light shot towards the tree hole and lit up the tree hole. At this moment, Heath could clearly feel that the spatial force field of the tree hole had changed. It was like a large door had been opened. Then, the elves spread out on both sides. "We can go in." As the wizard of the Tower of Order who was leading the way shouted, the team that stopped moved forward again and entered the tree hole. The huge tree hole made Heath involuntarily ring out the bomb shelters and tunnels on Earth. Thousands of people walked into it without any restrictions. Da-da-da-da. Drip drip. The noise of footsteps and low voices echoed in the tree hole. From time to time, the sound of water dripping could be heard. On the walls of the cave, there were clusters of green light, like pairs of eyes in the dark night. When he walked past these areas, Heath could clearly feel these eyes looking at him. Their eyes were filled with vigilance, causing one to feel a little nervous. He walked forward like this for over 10 minutes before he arrived outside the cave. Following that, the entire bloody battlefield finally opened up before Heath's eyes. The unprecedented spectacular picture. Chapter 188, The City Wall. Heath looked at the scenery in front of him. How should he put it? It was as if he had stepped into another world. There was also a very tall ancient tree of life here. The city wall was built around the roots of the ancient tree. The circumference was hard to calculate, but the height was about 700 or 800 meters. At this moment, Heath and the others were on a half-moon platform in front of one of the city walls. In front of them was an endless wilderness. What they saw was a grayish-black land. There was not a single blade of grass on the ground, and there was not a single speck of green in sight. High in the sky, there were 3 blood-red moons hanging, and the blood-like red light sprinkled on the ground. Woo-woo! Put the arrows into the warehouse as soon as they are delivered. Someone check if there are any enchantments. Every soldier must be given magic potions. Every dwarf, behave yourself. Don't let me hear any drunkards. Hurry up, the wraiths may appear at any time. The long sound of the horn and the sound of military orders were heard one after another. A human general in dark golden armor was making military arrangements for the soldiers on the city wall. Under the command of the elf general, groups of soldiers entered the combat area. Other than the humans and elves, there were also centaurs with big noses that were only half the height of a human, half the height of a dwarf, half the size of a horse, and so on. They were races that had only been seen in books before. Is this the bloody battlefield? The atmosphere is so heavy. Are we going to fight in such a place? Is that a dwarf? And a centaur? Whispers rose and fell. Whether they were extraordinary or ordinary human knights, they were all shocked by the scene in front of them. This was something that they had never come into contact with since they came from the Underdark Tresia. The Underdark Tresia and even the entire west coast were close to the coastline. There were more people who came into contact with the sea folk, and it was rare for other races to see them. Wizard Bonate, who was in charge of leading Heath and the others, suddenly pointed at the general who was lecturing them and introduced, "That sir is Advanced Wizard Robert. He is the temporary commander of the bloody battlefield. He will be in charge of you here." Advanced Wizard? Why is he dressed like a knight? Hearing Wizard Bonate's introduction, the crowd burst into an uproar again. Advanced Wizards were one of the few powerful figures in the Dark Forest. Even in the entire wizard world. They were also extremely powerful figures. Such figures in the wizard world were usually the masters of a large force, or even the rulers of a region. They were definitely the pillars of the wizard world. Heath could not help but look at him twice. This was the first time he had met a high-level wizard in the true sense. Especially, this wizard gave him a sense of déjà vu. Heath's gaze swept over the other party's armor and the cross-sword at his waist. Is he also a knight? No. I'm afraid he's not just a knight. At this moment, the general finished his work and walked over. Wizard Bonate quickly went up and greeted, "Sir Robert." Bonate was a powerful wizard who had already entered the late stages of the wizard realm. He was also affiliated with a powerful organization like the Tower of Order. He was definitely an existence that would be worshipped wherever he went. However, this wizard Robert just waved his hand casually. Then, Robert's gaze fell on the crowd in front of him. He asked, "Are these the warriors sent by the Underdark Tresia?" Bonnet said, "Yes, sir." Robert looked around. His eyebrows were originally a little furrowed, but at this moment, they were clearly relaxed, giving people a sense of relief. He nodded and said, "Finally, a batch of decent quality." At this moment, his gaze fell on Heath. As if he had suddenly discovered something, he looked up and down at Heath and suddenly asked, "Grand Knight?" Heath was slightly startled. This was the first time someone had seen his strength at a glance. Seeing that Heath had caught Robert's attention, Wizard Bonate quickly introduced, "Sir Robert, this is Wizard Heath. He is a genius recently nurtured by Shadow Tower. He has only been in the wizard world for 10 years. After hearing Bonate's introduction, Robert's eyes lit up. He nodded repeatedly and said, "To be able to advance to a wizard in just 10 years and at the same time possess the strength of a Grand Knight, he is worthy of the name of a genius." Anyone with a discerning eye could see that this Robert's status was extraordinary. Seeing Heath being praised by others, whether it was apprentices, wizards, or even pure-blooded people, they all cast envious gazes. Heath said humbly, "Thank you." Robert nodded with satisfaction. "I look forward to your performance in the bloody battlefield." Heath said, "Yes." Robert laughed out loud. "At least I got someone decent." Woo 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 woo. At this moment, a horn sounded. The sound of the horn was heavy and awkward. Hearing this sound, the smile on Robert's face froze. Flap! Flap! At the same time, the sound of wings flapping could be heard. An elf wearing a green hat on his head was flying over quickly. This elf was different from the other elves at the door. He actually had a pair of wings on his back. Heath looked at the elf curiously. This is a sky elf. Elves were divided into many types. Some could learn magic, some could transform into animals, and some could fly. Those who could fly were also called sky elves. The sky elf drew a smooth arc in the air and finally landed in front of Robert. She bowed and said, "Commander, the Wraith Seed is here. It's less than 10 miles from the city." Robert asked in a deep voice, "How many are there? Are there any high-level seeds?" The elf said, "The number is unknown, but there are no high-level seeds detected so far." Robert narrowed his eyes as if he was thinking about something. Seeing that something was wrong, Bonate quickly went forward and said, "Sir Robert, since you have something to do here, I'll take them down to settle down first." Before he could finish, Robert suddenly interrupted, "No." After a pause, he suddenly said, "Ask the warehouse to give each of them a set of battle equipment. They will fight together in a while." Bonate was shocked. "What?" He quickly said, "Sir, these are warriors who have just arrived. They have not gone through training yet." Robert said, "The battlefield is the best training ground. Letting them personally participate in a war is better than training thousands of times in the fortress." Bonate frowned. "This," Robert said without hesitation, "all right, I'm in charge here. Go down and make the arrangements." Seeing that, Bonate did not say anything else. "Yes." Then, he turned around and said to everyone, "You guys, follow me." Everyone followed Robert to the back. There was a spiral staircase at the back. After coming down from this staircase, the interior of the huge military fortress was also presented in front of Heath's eyes. There were many obelisks, tall scaffolding, mill, blacksmith shop, thick city walls, and so on. Everyone receive a set of equipment. Move quickly. They came to the warehouse, and under Bonate's command, everyone received a set of equipment. The human warrior received a full body armor, a cross sword, a short crossbow, and a dagger, all of which were enchanted. The apprentices received a wizard cloak and a long-handled staff, which were surging with tremendous elemental fluctuations. Obviously, they were all official-grade wizard tools. Official-grade wizard tools. "Oh my god! Is this for me?" Heath and the other wizards were still fine, but the apprentices were all shocked. Official wizard tools were something they didn't dare to imagine. Heath was also a little surprised. The Tower of Order was so generous. One must know that an official wizard tool cost at least hundreds of thousands of magic stones. To be able to take out so many at once, it was indeed worthy of being the highest ruler of the West Coast. "Put on your equipment and go up immediately. Listen to the arrangements." After taking the equipment, Heath followed the crowd back to the battlements, and Robert led a few officers to organize and deploy Heath and the others. Although it was said to be a battlefield experience for them, it was obvious that Robert did not dare to randomly send soldiers who had not been trained. He arranged them to a position at the back, far away from the main formation. This way, even if there was a stampede or something like that, they would not be able to affect the combat units in front. Heath was also arranged to the left side of the rear. However, he wanted to learn more about the bloody battlefield, so he took the initiative to switch to a position at the front. Although it was still not the main formation, it was still relatively close to the battlefield. The view here was wide enough to see the front of the city wall. Therefore, Heath stood on the city wall like the other soldiers around him, quietly looking forward. Time passed by slowly. The city wall suddenly became quiet. Heath felt that the combat units at the front were obviously a little nervous, and a murderous aura filled the entire battlements. A few minutes later. Something is coming. What is that? Fog, what a big fog. A commotion suddenly broke out among the crowd beside Heath. Following that, they saw some unusual things appearing in the distant wilderness. Very thick and heavy things spread over from the distant wilderness. They were like layers of tide that rushed onto the beach, rolling over in all directions. It was like a big hand that was closing in on them step by step. From top to bottom, it gave off a mysterious feeling. Just as everyone was curious about where this fog came from, suddenly, da-da-da! A series of footsteps sounded. Very quickly, a scene that caused one's scalp to go numb appeared. Everyone immediately knew where this fog came from. Chapter 189, Siege. In the thick fog, a huge team appeared. Skeletons with pale bones, zombies with maggots crawling all over their bodies, ghouls with sharp teeth and sharp mouths, ancient giant beasts that were rotting all over their bodies, and so on. Elves, humans, dwarves, and so on, were all over the races and species. There were thousands, tens of thousands, and millions of them. No one could see their numbers clearly at all. All they knew was that they were so densely packed that it made people's scalps go numb. The thick fog was formed by the dust that these monsters stirred up when they advanced. However, because there were too many of them, it looked as if there was a fog. These were the heroic warriors who had fought against Everett on this battlefield. After their deaths, their corpses were eroded by Everett's wraith, and they were revived, becoming the wraiths that attacked the humans. There are too many. How many? Can we really win? This is too ridiculous, this is too ridiculous. The sounds of swallowing and gasping rose and fell one after another. Heath and the other warriors who had just arrived were all stunned by this spectacular scene. Heath was no exception. Although he had participated in many wars since he transmigrated, and he had even personally commanded one or two, the combined forces of the two sides were only a few hundred or a few thousand people. He had never seen such a scale before. How many enemies were there? A few hundred? A few thousand? Tens of thousands? No one could identify them clearly. They were like ants. Everyone only dared to feel a chill in their hearts. Woo! 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 At this moment, the horn sounded again. The sound was deep and long. Heath, who was familiar with the art of war, knew that this was the sound of the horn preparing for battle. Immediately after, the sound of Robert's command was heard. This general, who was both a wizard and a knight, pulled out his cross sword with a clang and began to give the battle orders. Soldiers, it's time for you to perform. Bring out your abilities and let the newcomers behind see your bravery and teach them a good lesson. My most outstanding elven archers, get ready. Day! Day! The sound of orderly footsteps rang out. The moment Robert gave the order, a row of archers in front lined up in a straight line and stepped forward. At the same time, they undid the long bows on their shoulders. The bowstring was instantly drawn at an angle of 45 degrees, forming a full moon shape. Robert continued to shout, "Buff magic, get ready!" The apprentices standing in the back row stepped forward in unison and uttered a long and obscure incantation. One magic circle after another lit up under the feet of the elves, and a red light appeared on the surface of the elves' longbows. This is strength-enhancing magic? There's also an additional flying spell, and an explosive effect. This standard spell would light up the magic circle under the feet when it was cast. It was not difficult for knowledgeable wizards to determine the function of the magic circle by combining the spells cast by these magic circles. Heath had read out several spells from them to increase strength, increase range, and explode. It was obvious that this spell was specifically designed to defend the city. The army below continued to advance. 2,000 meters. 1,500 meters. 1,000 meters. Release the arrows. Robert ordered loudly. Swish! 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 The fierce sound of rushing wind exploded in the air. Arrows with red beams of light pierced through the wind and flew into the distance. With the support of magic, the arrows actually crossed a distance of 1,000 meters and plunged into the monster army. Following that, boom! 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 A violent explosion sounded. The ground exploded into flower flames one after another, and pillars of fire shot into the sky one after another. Fire! 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 Arrows rained down on the undead army one after another. Under the thunderous explosions, the sky-high flames swept up layer after layer, and the entire battlefield instantly turned into a sea of fire. The raging flames engulfed the undead army, and upon seeing this, the battlements immediately stirred up a heated discussion. Are they destroyed? Even a wizard wouldn't be able to withstand such an attack. Ah! Look! It's charging over. However, at this moment, a chilling scene appeared. The undead passed through the sea of flames and reappeared in front of everyone's eyes. Some of them were covered in flames, while others were charred. However, they were still charging forward. Even from a distance, they could feel the resentment emanating from their bodies. Bathed in the flames and the rain of arrows, the undead army continued to advance. 1,000 meters, 800 meters, 500 meters, 300 meters. Roar! When they were 500 meters away from each other, a series of roars suddenly came from below. The white skeletons suddenly took off parts of their hands, ribs, calves, and other bones, and quickly assembled them into white bone spears. They held the spears and ran forward, accelerating, and then threw the spears up. Whoosh! 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 The sharp sound of breaking wind exploded again, and the white bone spears actually tore through the wind. In an instant, they crossed a distance of 300 meters and shot up the city wall that was 700 to 800 meters long, shooting straight at the elves on the city tower. Shield! Protect! Magic! Protect! Robert's two commands rang out almost at the same time. The dwarf strong men standing behind the elves stepped forward together. Every dwarf held a shield that was several meters tall. The material seemed to be made of wood, but Heath could clearly hear the sound of metal as he moved. The shield was placed in front of the elves, and all the spears that flew towards them hit the shields. The dull clanging sounds of metal and the cracking sounds of bones were heard continuously. The white bone spears flew for a long time, but when they hit the shields, the dwarves behind them still felt as if they were struck by lightning. Every shield shook violently, and the dwarves had to clench their teeth to resist the shields. It was not until the wizard's defensive spells arrived that they gradually stabilized. Heath was shocked by the scene. According to what he had read in the books, every dwarf was born with divine strength. An adult dwarf's strength alone was comparable to an official human knight. However, dwarves at this level could not even hold a shield. They could only stabilize it with the help of wizard's magic. From this, it could be seen how terrifying the power of the undead below was. The bloody battlefield. Cassandra really isn't exaggerating. While Heath was exclaiming in surprise, the undead army had already rushed to the bottom of the tower and began to attack the city. They didn't carry any siege weapons, nor did they plan to use any siege weapons. Instead, they climbed up with their bare hands. Yes, they directly inserted their arms into the stone wall and climbed up. When their arms were broken, they fell down. The undead at the back stepped on the arms embedded in the wall and climbed up, layer by layer, just like that. This simply stunned the newcomers like Heath. Those who were chosen to come to the bloody battlefield were more or less experienced on the battlefield. However, this was the first time everyone present had seen such a strategy. Release arrows. Magic. Throw scrolls. Potions. Under Robert's command, the combat units in the front row, the spell-casting units in the back row, and the elven archers all launched an attack on the army at the foot of the city. They fired arrows, cast spells, threw magic scrolls, and even single-use magic potions. Before this, Heath had thought that combining magic and military was his original invention. Now, he realized that he was really looking at the sky from the bottom of a well. There were many more wizard tools used here than he was, and they were used more skillfully than he did. Some of the scrolls and magic potions that were thrown out made the walls slippery, some rolled oil, and some fell rocks, all of them were combined with the defense of the city. However, what made Heath even more shocked was that even in the face of such an abundant defense, they still seemed to be helpless against these undead. There were simply too many of them. And they were not afraid of death. After the first ones who climbed up were beaten down, the ones behind stepped on the arms left behind in front of them and continued to climb up. The first wave of undead stepped on the first wave of undead and continued to climb upwards. As the second wave of undead stepped on the first wave of undead, they created a pile of corpses that was as tall as the city wall. The first wave of undead stepped on the city wall as well. Roar! The undead let out a roar filled with resentment and rushed onto the city wall. At the same time, Robert's command resounded throughout the entire fortress. Prepare for battle! Clang! Clang! The cold sound of metal interweaving exploded. The human warriors pulled out their cross swords, the elves pulled out their crescent-shaped scimitars, and the dwarves raised their axes. In the next moment, the sound of killing resounded across the sky. Kill! 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 Chapter 190, Charge! Kill! 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 Amidst the deafening battle cries, the meat grinder of war was completely turned on. The soldiers on the city walls, including humans, elves, dwarves, centaurs, and so on, raised their cross swords, spears, machetes, and axes and charged at the enemies in front of them, exchanging blows with them. Pft! 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 Clang! Clang! Caw caw caw! All of a sudden, limbs were flying, and blood was raining. Under the attack of the fortress army, the army of the undead that rushed to the top of the tower fell one by one, broken bones and broken limbs flying everywhere. But there were so many of them. And they were undead. According to the strength of the undead characteristics, wizards were divided into 4 levels from beginner to peak, and the undead spirits of these things were up to level 3, the top level being level 4. One had to know that Heath's necromancer's staff only had a level 1 undead characteristic. Once a corpse was eroded by the wraith, every cell and every elemental particle would be attached to the wraith, and the whole body would have the undead characteristic. This was reflected in the current situation in the war. A skeleton had obviously been smashed into pieces, but the broken bone hand was still climbing forward and attacking. If one was not careful, the broken arm would grab onto an ankle, the back of one's body, or the neck. Then, they would use the sharp finger bones to attack. Although the vital parts of the soldiers were protected by enchanted armor, these things were like gangrene, which greatly affected their combat ability. Moreover, if they continued to attack, their defense would be broken sooner or later. The fortress army was obviously prepared in this aspect. Front row, retreat. Back row, up. Following Robert's command, the warriors standing in the front row all retreated. The spellcasters who were waiting at the back quickly stepped forward to cast the purification spell, expelling the broken limbs on the warriors. However, there was a problem. The number of broken limbs that the warriors received was different. Some warriors were covered in broken limbs, while some only had 1 or 2. Some warriors were not even attacked by these accessories at all. This one-size-fits-all method caused a large portion of the warriors who did not need to be cleaned up to retreat, resulting in a waste of resources. If it was just this point, it would have been fine, even if they did not need to clean up and retreat to rest and adjust. However, the troublesome part was that Robert used the 422 battle formation on the battlefield. This battle formation was characterized by high defense density, strong defense when defending, and it was one of the best defensive formations. However, this battle formation had a major weakness, which was that the battle formation conversion was not flexible. It was certainly not a problem when they were defending, but once the battle formation was switched, no matter how well trained the team was, it was inevitable that there would be chaos. This was a typical example. After a few rounds of alternating front and back rows, there was quite a bit of chaos in the front row. Robert had to run back and forth, making adjustments and arrangements one by one. At this moment, roar! A roar suddenly came from the front of Heath and the others. A giant undead that was 7 to 8 meters tall rushed up the battlements, waving its huge arms and starting to attack the front. Giants belonged to a branch of the tall dwarves. They were classified into the dwarves, and they had many characteristics of the dwarves. For example, they were born with divine strength and had a good physique. When paired with their huge bodies, they were even more terrifying. Even in terms of strength alone, each giant had at least the strength of a peak knight. One could imagine what the consequences would be if it rushed up and swept the battlefield. That huge arm swept across the battlefield like a big tree. Wherever it passed by, it swept the warriors' casual pants, causing them to fall to the side. Then, it beat them and stomped them like a big mole. One by one, the warriors were smashed into meat paste. Originally, just the giants alone could not cause such a huge amount of damage. The key was that this row of warriors happened to be in a chaotic moment when the formation was alternating. The spellcasters at the back row were busy removing the pendants on the retreating warriors. No one could control it. War was a matter of showing one's face. The giants smashed randomly at the front, and soon, a gap appeared on this side. The number of dead souls that attacked this side also increased. What was worse was that there was still an endless stream of undead souls charging up from behind. Seeing that they were about to be defeated, Heath and the other warriors at the back became anxious. The quality of the warriors chosen by the Tower of Order was excellent. Although the crisis was imminent, not many people showed any fear. Most of them pulled out their weapons and wanted to help. However, everyone had come from the battlefield and knew how dangerous it was to act without hearing the command on the battlefield. The slightest carelessness would only make things worse, and it might even cause an even greater chain reaction. Therefore, even if everyone wanted to go forward and rescue them, no one dared to act rashly. They could only hold their weapons and stay where they were. However, at this moment, one person broke away from the group and rushed forward alone. Heath. The other warriors did not dare to rush forward because they were afraid that they would not be able to help. On the other hand, Heath was a wizard and a grand knight. He had excellent military knowledge and was fully confident that he would be able to wipe out all of this. With such a great opportunity to perform meritorious deeds, why not go forward? Coming to the front, Heath waved his right hand and took out the necromancer's staff from his dimensional pocket. Although the staff given by the Tower of Order was also an official level wizard tool, it was more focused on team battles. Its individual ability was not as good as Heath's necromancer's staff, and more importantly, it had a spell that Heath needed the most. After a short incantation, Heath softly chanted, "Necromancy." As the incantation was chanted, the surging soul fire quickly surged out of the skull and swept up the remains on the ground. The remains that had just regained their silence after the wraiths had been dispelled became active again with the infusion of the soul fire. One by one, the collapsed corpses held their weapons and stood tall. Skeletons, zombies, ghouls. An army of the undead was pulled up in an instant. Standing in front of the army of the undead, Heath did not attack immediately. He felt that something was missing. Bang! At this moment, a human knight was suddenly hit by a giant, and a dull sound was heard. The enchanted armor was shattered like white paper under the giant's immense strength. The fragile body that had lost its magic protection was instantly smashed into a pile of meat paste. The cross-shaped sword in the knight's hand was sent flying. It spun in the air for a few rounds before falling to the ground. It was as if something was arranged in the unseen world. The cross-shaped sword just happened to land in front of Heath and was inserted diagonally into the ground a few feet away from him. Seeing the cross-shaped sword, Heath finally realized what he lacked. He casually took off his cloak and threw it aside, revealing the lightweight black leather armor underneath. He placed the necromancer's staff outside. Under the effect of the wizard's force field, the necromancer's staff naturally floated in the air and circled around him. Then, Heath, who had freed his hand, strode forward and pulled out the cross-shaped sword from the ground with a backhand. Clang! The loud sound of the sword was still sonorous and powerful even on this noisy battlefield. The cold light on the blade was so dazzling. Roar! The undead army roared in unison, like warriors with high fighting spirit, singing the battle song before the battle and chanting the oath before killing the enemy. The voice was like thunder, resounding in the sky, and the momentum was like fire, burning the entire battlefield. Wizards are indeed better with swords. Heath grinned. The next moment, under the stunned gazes of the warriors, Heath led his army of undead and charged forward resolutely. Chapter 191, Defend Alone. At this moment, the battle had reached its climax. Under the leadership of the giant, the enemy had opened up a gap in the defense of the fortress. The surrounding warriors were all scattered, forcing the surrounding warriors to be at a loss as to how to fight. Seeing that the battle was about to collapse, Robert had already rushed over. At this moment, Heath rushed forward with the undead army. This new team was undoubtedly like a cross between a boat and a lamp in a dark room. Under Heath's command, the undead army formed a battle formation and quickly opened up a defensive line in front. He did not try to use the undead army to fill in the gaps in the warrior formation and fight side by side with the warriors. The formation of the fortress army had completely fallen into disarray. If he rushed in like this, it would only backfire and add to the chaos. Therefore, he directly controlled the undead army to cross the chaotic battlefield and rush to the front, opening up a new line of defense here. With the establishment of this new line of defense, the charging undead army was directly intercepted here, as if a dam had been erected in the middle of the turbulent river. Blocking the source of the flood, it was much easier to govern the river, and it was the same here. After blocking the endless stream of undead behind him, although there were still many undead that rushed up, they were just water without a source. It was only a matter of time before they were cleaned up. The originally chaotic situation was instantly under control. Seeing this scene, Robert, who was rushing over with his men, could not help but have his eyes light up. As the commander-in-chief of the army, he could obviously see that Heath's sudden attack was not because he was hot-headed. The undead defense line that was spread out was methodical, and the battle formation was well coordinated. It was an extremely high level of military literacy, and it was definitely not just because of his hot-blooded recklessness. After seeing that, Robert did not waste any more words. He led his men and turned to the side. Now, similar situations had appeared in many places on the battlefield. There were still many places waiting for him to put out the fire. On the other side, on the battlefield. Ka. 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 Pu. 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 The sound of bones breaking and the sound of sharp blades piercing into flesh rang out continuously. Heath's crossguard sword danced like a windmill, and the dazzling golden light on the blade of the sword shone continuously. With this golden light, he moved like a hurricane in this battlefield. Wherever he passed, white bones fell and zombies collapsed. He was like a fierce tiger that pounced into a flock of sheep, unstoppable. Although these corpses had been strengthened because of the wraiths, their overall combat strength was only between a beginner knight and an advanced level knight. This level of combat strength was a threat to ordinary warriors, but it was not enough for a single warrior like him, who was a wizard grand knight with double buffs. He was just like a cockroach. At most, there were a little more of them. However, if he had no problems here, the other warriors would not be so relaxed. A large number of dead souls had rushed up just now. Although the source was blocked by Heath, there were still a large number of dead souls gathered on the battlements. The defenders on the battlements were a little flustered because of the collapse of the formation. The progress of clearing the undead was unusually slow, and there were even continuous casualties. In the end, these warriors were basically just apprentice knights. There were only a few official knights, and their individual combat ability was very limited. Relying on the formation and magic, they could burst out with strong combat ability, but it was impossible to fight on their own. Seeing that the battlefield behind them was once again in a stalemate, and the casualties were even increasing, Heath could not stand it anymore. Anyway, the defensive line here had been built, and it was not of much use for him to stay here, so he simply turned the spearhead. He killed his way back alone. The moment Heath rushed back, he aimed at the giant in front of him. This thing was too fierce. It had endless strength and was huge in size. Every swing of its arms and sweep of its legs could send a group of warriors flying. A fist could create a patty, and no one on the battlefield could stop it. At this time, the giant rushed into a crowd of people. Behind it was a group of warriors who were fighting with the undead. This place happened to be in a T-shaped groove. The area was narrow, and dozens of people and horses on both sides were fighting in this narrow space. If this giant rushed in and threw a barrage of attacks without distinguishing between friend and foe, one could imagine the consequences. At the critical moment, a dwarf with a big beard rushed up and blocked the giant's way. The giant did not stand on ceremony. It raised its two hammer-like fists and smashed them heavily on the top of the dwarf's head. It was as if Mount Tai was pressing down on him. The dwarf quickly raised the double-edged axe in his hand and crossed it into a cross. Some giants could awaken their race's talent metal attribute. They could change the skin, parts of their limbs, and even the cell structure of the entire body. They could make the cells into metal objects and possess the true strength of steel. This was the case for the giant in front of them. When the fist smashed down, the surface of the two fists immediately glowed with a metallic luster. The entire fist turned into a pair of iron fists and collided with the dwarf below. Clang! The sound of metal colliding like a gong rang out. The dwarf's body trembled violently, and his face instantly turned into the color of a pig's liver. There was even a caw sound from the ground, and the floor that had been protected by magic actually shattered. Seeing that the attack had missed, the giant swung its fists again and again. For a moment, only the sound of clang 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 could be heard continuously. The giant was like a mole, smashing its fists at the dwarf. Meanwhile, the dwarf's legs were already completely embedded in the ground. His body trembled continuously as if he had been struck by lightning, and the blood in his mouth had already spurted out wildly, dyeing the clothes on his chest red. Finally, after a series of punches, the dwarf could no longer hold on. The two double-edged axes in his hands fell to the ground with a clang. At the same time, the giant once again raised its fist high and smashed it down at the dwarf. One could imagine the consequences of this hit. The dwarf wanted to escape, but his legs were completely embedded in the ground, unable to move. He could only watch as the fist came crashing down, his eyes filled with despair. Just as being smashed into a meat pie was inevitable, the space in front of the dwarf suddenly twisted, and a blurry black shadow quietly appeared in front of him. Following that, a silver-white cloth that looked like liquid metal appeared in front of the two of them, blocking the giant's fist. Dong! There was a muffled sound. It was as if the giant had smashed its fist into the water. A strange power appeared on the liquid metal. Under the effect of this power, the giant's invincible fist was completely absorbed. The liquid metal only stirred up a layer of ripples on the surface, and then it didn't move at all. Not only that, after the giant's fist was drained of the huge power, the liquid metal also moved forward to wrap around the giant's fist and nailed it in the air. It was as if there was an unknown and terrifying force holding it, and the giant could not pull its arm back no matter what. The dwarf, who had been waiting for death in despair, was stunned. He widened his bell-like eyes and said with his mouth wide open, "My God, what kind of spell is this? Of course it's a wizard's spell. A soft voice came from the front. The blurry black shadow in front suddenly became clear, and the surface of its body became more colorful. In an instant, it turned into a young man. After controlling the giant with the combination of the mimicry shield and the static stance, Heath immediately jumped onto the giant's shoulder. Standing on the giant that was as tall as a building, Heath was like a baby. He raised the crossguard sword in his hand and slashed it across the giant's neck. The giant instinctively sensed the danger and quickly activated its race talent metal attribute to instantly metalize its neck. To be fair, this race talent of the giant was very powerful. This was a type of metallization that was much closer than ordinary metal molecules and atoms. Once it was metallized, the physical attacks of ordinary apprentices and knights were basically useless against it. Even an official rank wizard would have a headache for a while. It was a pity that it met Heath. He was a powerful wizard who grasped many spells and had rich battle experience. More importantly, he had already comprehended some of the elemental laws. The instant he sensed the metallization of the giant's neck, a dense black gas that looked like liquid gushed out from the tip of Heath's sword. This was a darkness-type spell, Dark Corrosion. This was a spell that was constructed using acid as its blueprint. It had extremely strong corrosive properties, especially when it was used against metal-type substances. It could destroy the structure of the elements and destroy them from the inside. According to the rule that the elements complemented and countered each other, when the black gas appeared, it immediately invaded the metallized neck of the giant and destroyed the structure. Under the effect of this force, the giant's metallized neck was crumbling at a visible speed. The ordinary cross-sword in Heath's hand seemed to have turned into a divine weapon that could cut through iron like mud. With a pu sound, it cut straight into the giant's neck. He then held the hilt of the sword and pulled it across the giant's neck. Ka! The giant's large head rolled to one side and fell heavily to the ground. The giant's large body suddenly stiffened. If it was an ordinary undead creature, it would have died from this attack. However, wraiths were different. Wraiths with level 3 undead characteristics would corrode every cell and every element of the corpse. Because of this, after a short pause, the giant's huge headless corpse began to move again. It swung its empty hand at Heath. The dwarf's expression changed drastically when he saw this. He quickly shouted, "Be careful!" Seeing that Heath was about to be hit by the fist, what was surprising was that the giant's fist missed. Heath, who was supposed to be standing on his shoulder, suddenly disappeared. Patter, patter, patter. While the dwarf was still in shock, he heard the sound of wings flapping. A group of crows suddenly flew up from the giant's shoulder, where Heath was standing. They flapped their wings and flew up into the air. It seemed to be the shape-shifting spell commonly used by wizards. The crows flapped their wings and flew up into the sky. Black feathers fell down as they flew. These feathers landed on the giant's body. As soon as the two came into contact, the feathers exploded into balls of flames, which quickly wrapped around the giant's huge body and began to burn. A large number of flames flowed into the body through the gap in the neck. Heath's innate spell, Indestructible. The arrival of the indestructible spell also marked the end of the battle. As the name suggested, once it was entangled by the flames, it would continue to burn like gangrene until every inch of its body and every cell was burned. It was truly indestructible. Under the attack of the high temperature from the inside and outside, the giant's huge body quickly shrank and burned until it fell heavily with a bang. The huge body completely fell into a pile of powder. The wraith that was originally attached to the body naturally disintegrated after it lost its physical body. Flap, flap, flap. The sound of wings flapping could be heard. A crow slowly descended from the high sky. Its body twisted and deformed in the air. When it landed on the ground, it also turned into a human figure. Clack! It was the sound of boots landing on the ground. Chapter 192, Stigmata. The warriors at the back were stunned. Whether they were apprentice knights, apprentices, or even wizards, all of them widened their eyes and looked forward as if they had seen a ghost. It was a long description, but in fact, it only took a moment for the crisis on the battlefield to reach the point where Heath killed the giant undead. The people were still worried about the crisis on the battlefield, but they saw Heath rush forward alone and instantly pull up an army to block the undead in front of him. He even turned back to support the battlefield to kill the giant undead. It was not an exaggeration to say that he alone could block an army of 1,000. The dwarf opened his mouth wide and said, Are you sent by Muraden to save Sam?" Muraden was a legendary dwarf during the War of the Gods. He was a legendary hero of the dwarves and was also regarded as a god by them. Heath said, Muraden will not pay attention to these things on the battlefield. Pay attention to the present. After saying that, he threw a healing spell at the dwarf, then turned around and threw himself into the battlefield again. After the giant fell, the crisis was quickly effectively controlled. Without the giant rampaging on the battlements, the remaining undead were only a little more numerous, but they were no longer a big threat to the warriors on the battlements. Everyone quickly stabilized their positions and reorganized their battle formation. Then, they began a one-sided massacre of the undead on the battlements. One by one, the skeletons fell apart and zombies fell one by one. The accumulated undead on the battlements were quickly cleared away, and safety was completely restored. Wizard, thank you for your help. Leave the rest to me and my warriors. A warrior who seemed to be the commander ran up with the soldiers who had regrouped. Heath did not stand on ceremony. He commanded the undead army to retreat and make way for the front row. Then, he left some of the undead to stand in the back row to fill in the gaps in the formation of the warriors to prevent the situation from happening again. He led the undead army to the side. The defensive line on the battlements was all in a 422 formation. At this time, the same situation had occurred at several points. The undead could still maintain the formation for an hour anyway. Helping a group of undead was also helping a group of undead. But how long will this firefighting last? Thinking of this, Heath could not help but glance at the wilderness below the city wall. He saw that the wilderness below the city wall was completely covered in thick dust. The dense undead within the dust were swarming towards the city wall in groups, endless. These undead were indeed not strong. At most, they were only apprentice knights or knights. In front of a wizard like Heath, they were just bigger bugs. However, there were too many of them. A cockroach was not scary, but what about 1,000, 10,000, or even 100,000? That was how it was here. These undead seemed to be endless. After killing one, there was another. After killing a group, another group rushed up. It was as if there was no end to them. Under the city wall, there was already a thick layer. In many places, the piles of corpses had already reached the height of the city wall. The later undead did not even need to climb the city wall anymore. They just stepped on the body in front of them and could come up. The defense of the wall had been greatly weakened. Now, the warriors were full of energy and had not been greatly affected, but in the long run, sooner or later, they would be exhausted. If they didn't come up with something that was going to make a difference. Woo! 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 Just then, a bugle call suddenly sounded. This bugle call compared to all the other bugle calls sounded much longer. As this bugle call sounded, Heath suddenly felt an unusually surging spiritual power sweeping over. Under the impetus of this unprecedentedly powerful spiritual power, a huge amount of elements suddenly gathered in the surroundings. The densely packed elements had practically formed elemental particles in the air that could be seen by the naked eye. It was like the arrival of an elemental tide. With the fortress as the center, an elemental storm was set off. What? What happened? Good, what a terrifying elemental fluctuation. How could there be such a terrifying elemental fluctuation? This power. Could it be? Could it be? Every spellcaster present, whether they were apprentices or wizards, had a drastic change in expression at this moment. They looked around in bewilderment. At the same time, runes suddenly lit up on the city wall one after another, and then formed a huge magic circle that covered the entire fortress and even a part of the wilderness on the surface of the fortress. In the middle of this huge magic circle, an old man slowly rose up. It was an old man who looked to be in his 60s or 70s. He had a long goatee and long hair that draped over his shoulders. They were all silver white in color. The robe he wore was also white. At the same time, he held a long staff in his hand. It was also white, and his entire body was emitting a blinding white light. He was as dazzling as a small sun in the sky, illuminating the entire fortress. His white robe fluttered in the wind. The old man raised his staff with both hands, facing the wind, and chanted a long incantation in a loud voice. Hu! Hu! As he chanted the incantation, a violent gale suddenly blew up between the heaven and earth. Within the gale, numerous wind blades that were about an inch long appeared. They were densely packed into millions or tens of millions. It was impossible to count them all. At this moment, time seemed to have stopped. Only the sound of the wind was whistling. Only the wind blades were blowing. The entire world had turned into a world of wind. They entered the domain of the wind. Stig! Stigmata. It's a stigmata wizard. It's the stigmata domain. The wizards could not hold back their excitement and shouted. They all focused on the old man who looked like a god in the sky. Their eyes were shining with unprecedented heat. After all, that was the goal of all the wizards present. It was the pinnacle of life. The stigmata domain. At the same time, the old man raised his staff and pointed to the sky. Then, he held the staff and swung it downward. Like a brave warrior who had heard the horn, the countless wind blades floating in the sky all moved at that moment and slashed at the undead on the city tower. The sound was earth-shattering. The wind blades that covered the sky and earth swept past with unstoppable momentum. Skeletons, zombies, giants, and even ancient giant beasts were all crushed into pieces under the concentrated attack of the wind blades. They were cut into powder by the wind blades and mountain torrents. Like a gust of wind blowing through a room full of dust, the originally noisy city tower suddenly became clear. Within the range of vision, there was no trace of a dead soul. Some of it seemed to have never happened. Only the bone fragments and broken pieces that drifted along with the wind, and the rain of blood that fell from the sky showed that what happened before was not an illusion. The noisy battlements became silent at this moment. Apprentice knights, apprentices, wizards, humans, elves, dwarves, all the people, and all the living beings could not help but look at the old figure standing proudly in the wind. Their burning gazes were as if they were looking at a god. Heath was no exception. It was his first time witnessing such a powerful force that could dominate the world and look down on the world. Heath felt every cell and every inch of his soul become excited, and he felt an unprecedented surge of emotions. Is this the stigmata domain? Stigmata. Stigmata. The battle ended with the appearance of the old man. Although the endless army of undead soon returned and piled up to the scale of the attack in front of them a few more times. At this time, the old man would appear and cast an area of effect spell to clean it up. After several times, the army of wraiths finally came to an end. With the death of the last wraith, the defensive battle this time came to an end. At the same time after the war ended, Heath welcomed an exciting event. An event that he had been looking forward to for 10 years. Beep, the supernatural extraction system has been upgraded. Host, please check it in time. A familiar voice sounded once again. The system that had disappeared for 10 years had finally returned at this moment. Chapter 193, Upgrade. System. When the voice sounded, Heath had just walked into the dormitory arranged by the fortress. He was busy tidying up his room and did not pay much attention to it. He was stunned for a moment until he confirmed that it was not an illusion. It's really the system. Heath was shocked. He quickly said, "Open the system and check it." Beep, the upgrade of the supernatural extraction system has ended. This upgrade has taken 10 years, 6 months, 28 days, 16 hours, 32 minutes, and 28 seconds. After 10 years, he finally heard that familiar voice again. In the past, when the system was around, he did not feel anything, but now, this voice was becoming more and more pleasing to his ears. This upgrade has increased the system's strength and added the following functions on top of the original system. 1. Deep extraction. It can extract extraordinary substances at a deeper level to obtain more value, including but not limited to attributes, knowledge, energy, and so on. 2. Spatial extraction. Other than specific substances, normal substances can be extracted within a certain range without physical contact. P.S. The maximum extraction range is 100 meters. The closer the extraction distance is, the more attributes can be extracted. A familiar light blue light unfolded in front of his eyes. Information was displayed on it one after another. Beside it, there was a detailed explanation of the increase in attributes. I wonder how the specific effect of the increase will be. Forget it, why don't I just give it a try? After making a decision in his heart, Heath immediately grabbed his cloak and left. A while later, at the bloody fortress, the land of the dead. The land of the dead was an empty space on the west side of the fortress that was used to dispose of the corpses. The corpses of the warriors who died on the battlefield were all sent here. When Heath arrived here, he saw that the warriors were busy dealing with the corpses of the warriors who had died in the previous battles. There were circular altars set up above the empty space. The corpses of the warriors who had died in the previous battles were carried onto the altars. When they moved the turntable beside them, the altars would shoot out extremely high-temperature flames and turn the corpses into ashes in an instant. Because of the existence of wraiths, there was no such thing as burial on the bloody battlefield. After everyone died, they would be sent here for cremation. Heath found the logistics officer and explained his identity. He said that he had nothing to do and hoped that he could help. The discipline of the army was very high. It was not like he could get involved just because he wanted to. However, Heath in front of him was an official wizard. He took the initiative to offer his help, and it was the dirty work of disposing of the bodies. How could others not agree? Ah? Wizard? Are you serious? Then. Okay. If there is anything you need, feel free to help us. Just like that, Heath entered the military crematorium and began to test the system. He first found a dead apprentice knight and put one hand on the apprentice knight's shoulder. This action, which he had not done for a long time, gave Heath a strange feeling, as if he had suddenly returned to school after working for so many years and poked the back of his female desk mate with a pen. Sighing in his heart, Heath said, "Extraction." Beep, extraction successful. Agility plus 0.1. Beep, extraction successful. Strength plus 0.02. Beep, extraction successful. Vitality plus 0.01. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained sword technique while in fencing. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained knight's secret manual while in secret technique. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained poem Alicia. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained soul fragment. Heath's mind jolted. Looking at the long string of notifications that were jumping up and down, he could not help but open his mouth. This is too ridiculous. From attributes to swordsmanship, from swordsmanship to poetry, and this soul fragment. Heath took a look. The soul fragment referred to a small part of this apprentice knight's life history, the most precious memory. All of these, in this instant. All of it was picked up by him. Is this the power after the upgrade? Heath was shocked. Let's try the remote extraction effect. Thinking of this, he immediately took a step back and silently chanted in his heart, "Spatial extraction." Beep, please select the extraction target. Single/multiple. He could also extract multiple targets at the same time? He first tried the single extraction. Single. As soon as he finished speaking, Heath immediately felt that a special tentacle had appeared on his spiritual power. Similar to other spiritual tentacles, it could also be controlled by him. He then controlled this spiritual tentacle to touch a corpse more than 10 meters away. Extract. Beep, extraction successful. Strength plus 0.08. Beep, extraction successful. Strength plus 0.01. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained Hilawatt cross sword art. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained soul fragment. The quality of the attributes was lower than the previous extraction, and the total number of items extracted was also 2 items lower than before. However, the advantage was that this was remote extraction. The concealment and convenience were greatly enhanced, and some who he could not make physical contact with could now be easily extracted. Next is the multiple spatial extraction. Heath carried out the spatial extraction again. This time, he chose multiple targets. A strange touch came from his spiritual power again. However, this time, it was not an additional spiritual tentacle, but a spiritual net. With him as the center, a circular spiritual net was spread out. Its diameter was exactly 100 meters. Beep, do you want to extract the extraordinary substance within this range? Was this the simultaneous extraction? Heath tried it out, and he could control the circle to shrink freely. He then said, "Extract." As soon as he finished speaking, it was like a white bird chirping in unison. Beep, extraction successful. Strength plus 0.02. Beep, extraction successful. Agility plus 0.03. Beep, extraction successful. Vitality plus 0.01. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained soul fragment. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained sword technique white sail cross. Beep, extraction successful. Strength plus 0.02. Beep, extraction successful. Agility plus 0.03. Beep, extraction successful. Vitality plus 0.01. Beep, extraction successful. Beep, 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 beep. Heath's head almost exploded. After repeated attempts, Heath had basically grasped the changes after the system upgrade. First, the extraction attributes had been strengthened. In the past, the system could only extract one attribute for a single target, and it was 2 decimal points later. Sometimes, it did not even have a specific value. But now, it could extract multiple attributes at once, and basically, one attribute would be able to extract a higher value, and it could also extract other knowledge. If the system was compared to a water vessel, the system was like a spoon in the past, but now, the system was like a bucket. Heath's first round of battle at the Bloody Fortress ended just like that. A few days after the battle ended, the Bloody Fortress held a banquet to celebrate their previous victory and to welcome the arrival of Heath's group of warriors. During this banquet, Heath also gained a deeper understanding of the Bloody Fortress and the bloody battlefield. Chapter 194, Gala. A few days later, Stardust Tower, Gala. The venue of the gala in the Bloody Fortress was the Stardust Tower, which was a tall tower on the east side of the fortress. There was a huge banquet hall in the main tower, and a spacious square surrounded the main tower. The people who came to attend the gala were mainly the new recruits from the Underdark Tresia, such as Heath, and the combat troops who fought on the battlements that day. The apprentice knights, elves, dwarves, and other ordinary warriors of the other races were having an open-air bonfire banquet in the square. Wizards, apprentices, some elite knights, and even some of the other races who had a certain status were invited to the Stardust Tower banquet hall. That evening, Heath chose an eye-pleasing gown and put on it neatly before heading to the banquet hall. There were 3 apprentices who came with him. They were Roval, Peter, and Martha. They were all recruits who had been recruited at the same time as him. They were assigned to Heath as assistants by the fortress and were responsible for following his orders and arrangements. At this moment, the group of people entered the banquet hall. The entire banquet hall was about half the size of a football field. It was circular and was surrounded by stone pillars that were in the shape of waves. The walls were embossed, and the floor was smooth and clean like marble. Every pattern was carefully selected. There was an arc-shaped dome above their heads. There was a bright starry sky above the dome. It was not the gloomy red moon starry sky outside, but the beautiful galaxy outside in its normal state. Hundreds and thousands of magic crystal lamps floated under the starry sky, reflecting the stars above, illuminating the entire hall. As spellcasters, everyone present had attended all kinds of banquets, but at this moment, including Heath, they were still attracted by the gorgeous interior of the banquet hall. The youngest, Martha, could not help but exclaim, "Wow, this banquet hall is too beautiful. Is the galaxy in the sky real?" Martha was only 15 years old this year. She came from the Kara family of the Blue Mill. She was only a low-level apprentice. The reason why she was recruited was because she had part of the bloodline of water demon Ava, that was one of the 16 ancient gods that were on par with Everett. This bloodline could control very powerful healing spells and was very useful on the battlefield. Beside her, Roval said with a bit of pride, "More or less. I heard from the elders in my family that this ceiling used space spells to directly project the galaxy outside. Some of the space runes were completed by my family." Roval was 18 years old, a low-level apprentice. He was the oldest among the 3 people. He was also a pure blood, and came from the Baritayan family. There was also Peter, who did not speak. He was the only muggle among the 3. He came from the Dusk Tower. Although he was only 16 years old, he already had the strength of an intermediate-level apprentice. Just like Heath, he was a muggle genius. Sir Robert and the others are here. And Sir Wizard Pierre, who is walking in the middle of them. What a beautiful, beautiful elf. At this moment, there was a commotion in the crowd. Everyone looked towards the gate. They saw a group of people walking in from the gate. There were knights, wizards, humans, elves, and even dwarves. These were all the generals of the Bloody Fortress. Walking at the front were 2 wizards and an elf. Heath had seen the 2 wizards before. They were Wizard Robert, who had commanded the battle that day, and Wizard Pierre, who had used a stigmata-level spell to clear the area. These days, Heath also knew the identity of Wizard Pierre. He was also one of the main generals of the Bloody Fortress. He was an advanced-level wizard who specialized in area of effect spells and magic arrays. That day's stigmata-level spell was completed with the help of the massive magic arrays in the fortress. He himself did not possess the strength of a stigmata level. Walking side by side with the 2 of them was an elf. One had to know that the 2 of them were already the supreme military commanders of the Bloody Fortress. To be able to walk side by side with them, it was difficult not to attract attention. From the moment they entered the battlefield, they had attracted the attention of everyone, including Heath. The first impression that this elf gave Heath was beauty. Bright eyes, beautiful eyebrows, exquisite facial features, creamy skin, and a graceful and charming figure. From appearance to figure, from skin to facial features, everything was done to the extreme, to the point of perfection. It was different from Karina's beauty and Shirley's charm. This was a pure beauty, like a piece of art that was completely pieced together with beautiful parts. That sister is so beautiful. Masha praised. Roval clicked his tongue and said, that is Princess Irina of the Moon Elf tribe. She is the most beautiful Moon Elf of this generation. How can she not be beautiful? The Elf tribe adopted a tribal system. They were made up of tribes. Their tribe was equivalent to a human kingdom, and the Moon Elf tribe was one of the more powerful tribes in the Elf tribe. Under the envious and admiring gazes of the people in the hall, Robert and the others went inside. They went to the innermost dance floor, where there was an area that was surrounded by guards. The people inside were the top people of the fortress. At this moment, beautiful music sounded. There was a band in the upper left corner of the banquet hall. They were made up of moon elves, flower fairies, magic harps, and so on. At this time, they were playing beautiful music. With the arrival of the music, the atmosphere of the banquet became lively. Martha looked at the dance floor over there and said excitedly, Lord Heath, Roval, Peter, let's go and dance. Heath shook his head. You guys go and play. He was not very interested in dancing, including this banquet. If it was not for Wizard Robert's insistence that he had to be there, he might not have come to this banquet. Martha and the other two looked at each other. The three of them had been specially arranged to be Heath's apprentice assistants. If Heath did not go, the three of them would not dare to leave their posts. Seeing this, Heath could not help but say, It's all right, you can go. Wizard Heath. Before he could finish his words, a voice came from behind. Heath turned his head and saw a young knight walking over. He had just followed Wizard Robert in and was probably Wizard Robert's personal guard. He jogged all the way to Heath and bowed solemnly. Sir Robert invites you over. Martha and the other two widened their eyes. Heath was also a little surprised. Invite me. As far as he knew, Robert's side were all very high-ranking figures. High-ranking generals of the Bloody Fortress, high-ranking elders of other races, high-ranking wizards, and so on. At the very least, they had to be at the level of a wizard master, and it had to be the kind of wizard master that had more power. Although Heath was a wizard, he should not be able to reach the same level as these people, right? The knight nodded and confirmed once again, yes. The eyes of Martha and the other two immediately lit up. Although they were pure bloods, they were also relatively collateral family members. Not to mention receiving treatment at Robert's level, even the favor of an ordinary wizard could make them feel flattered. Unfortunately, at this moment, the young knight added, Sir Robert only invited Wizard Heath to go alone. The three of them were greatly disappointed. Heath looked at the three of them with amusement and said, You three go play first. Then, under everyone's envious gazes, Heath followed the young knight to the area surrounded by the dance floor. The core area of the Bloody Fortress. Chapter 195, Reward. Along with the knight, they arrived at the encircled area by the dance floor. There were a few sofas set up here, and it looked like a reception room. At this moment, Wizard Robert was sitting on the sofa and chatting with the high-ranking generals of the Bloody Fortress. When they saw Heath coming over, everyone's eyes immediately turned to Heath, and they began to guess his identity. Without waiting for everyone to guess, Wizard Robert stood up and enthusiastically walked forward. Wizard Heath, you're finally here. Heath bowed and said, Wizard Robert. Robert laughed loudly and said, All right, there's no need to be so polite. Quickly come over and sit down. After saying this, he pulled Heath's hand and walked back. This scene once again caused the generals present to be amazed. Robert's status was so noble that even a ruler of a region had never seen him treat them so warmly. Could this be the young master of a large family? While everyone was astonished, Robert had already pulled Heath to sit on the sofa and introduced him to the generals present. He said, This is Wizard Heath, from Shadow Tower. He is the most outstanding genius of Shadow Tower in recent years. He has advanced to a wizard in just 10 years after coming to the wizard world. In addition, Wizard Heath is also a grand knight who is proficient in the art of war. Pausing for a moment, he said to an old man, Baxter, didn't you ask me how the chaos in the northwest corner was calmed down? It was Wizard Heath who did it. Everyone suddenly understood. Heath's brilliant performance on the battlements had long been spread in the fortress. Many people knew that there was a young wizard who had just arrived at the fortress and was calm in the face of danger. He helped to turn the fortress into a safe place. Robert was famous for cherishing talents in the fortress, so it was not surprising that he could perform like that in front of such a person. Wizard Baxter looked Heath up and down and smiled. Although I heard about your deeds first, I always thought that it was an exaggeration. After all, what kind of talent could there be in a place like the Underdark Treesia? Now that I see it, I know that I was conceited. You are indeed a young hero. Heath returned the bow humbly. Compared to what the Ice Emperor Wizard has done for the fortress, my meager strength is not worth mentioning. Baxter was stunned. You know me? Heath said, I heard about your deeds from the warriors in the dining hall. If you had not acted in time to freeze the collapsed area when the city wall collapsed, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Only a powerful wizard like you can use such a large area of solid city wall freely. It's worthy of the name of the Ice Emperor. This was a high-level wizard from the Bloody Fortress. In a battle, the city wall of the Bloody Fortress had been broken by a high-level species of wraiths. Baxter reacted quickly and froze the place, allowing the fortress to escape from danger. This was Baxter's most glorious battle achievement in the Bloody Fortress. Hearing Heath's words, he immediately caused a commotion in the venue. Ha ha ha, old fellow Baxter, look at how arrogant you are. This is enough for you to brag about for a lifetime. Even the new recruits who just arrived at the fortress know about it. Baxter's face was flushed red and he looked very comfortable. He did not expect that after so long, the basic level warriors would still be narrating his legend. However, these generals would never have thought that this was pure nonsense from Heath. No matter how much their achievements were worth bragging about, it had been so long ago. How could the basic level warriors talk about it every day? The reason why Heath knew about it was purely from the soul fragments extracted from the bodies of the dead warriors a few days ago. These soul fragments were the lives of the warriors, and many of them were related to the Bloody Fortress, and many of them were gossip about these generals. It was easy to find something to brag about. Anyone would like to hear something nice. Baxter was in a good mood and could not help but say, I heard that Wizard Heath is proficient in all kinds of spells, including ice spells. If there's a chance, we can exchange some ideas. Haha, this old man is too easy to coax. Heath was happy in his heart. He quickly said, it's my honor to receive the guidance of the Ice Emperor. Robert laughed and said, all right, old Baxter. Teaching disciples is your private matter. Don't take up public space here. Pausing for a moment, he turned to Heath and said, Wizard Heath, the main reason I invited you here is to thank you for your help earlier. It's thanks to your help that the Bloody Fortress has avoided even greater losses. I, Robert, am clear about the rewards and punishments. Since you have contributed to the Bloody Fortress, you should be rewarded. After saying that, he waved to one side. There were two knights on the other side, holding a tray in their hands. It was obvious that they had been waiting for a long time. After hearing Robert's words, they quickly carried the tray over and placed it in front of Heath. There was a bronze badge on the tray. The main body of the badge was a dragon. There were 3 grooves on it, and 2 of the grooves had a gem embedded in them. This was the Bloody Fortress Soldier Medal. It was something equivalent to a military rank. It represented a warrior's status, and treatment in the fortress. The medal was divided into 4 levels, black iron, bronze, silver, and gold. Each level was divided into 3 levels, lower, middle, and upper. For example, the medal in front of him was a bronze middle rank medal. Robert said, here, as the Supreme Commander of the Bloody Fortress, I officially award you with a bronze intermediate medal. I hope that you will continue to work hard. Heath immediately stood up and bowed. Haha, I just got here and I'm already promoted. This is too awesome. It was extremely difficult to upgrade this kind of soldier medal. According to what Heath had seen from the soul fragments that he had extracted, many warriors who had been in the fortress for several years had only been promoted to intermediate black iron. Although he was happy, Heath was not particularly surprised. An official rank wizard would receive a bronze badge once they were recruited into the Bloody Fortress. Previously, Heath had reduced the fort's losses on the battlefield, so it would not be too much to upgrade him by 1 rank, right? What really surprised Heath was Robert's next reward. Also, Robert took out his dimensional pocket and took out an item from it. It was a cross-shaped sword. Both hands held a cross-shaped sword. Its body was wider than the palm, and its blade was dark red. The hilt was black and red, and there was a red gem hidden in the sword garret. The whole thing looked exceptionally beautiful. The moment he saw the big sword, Heath's gaze was immediately attracted. He could not help but praise, "Good sword." As a knight, he still had basic eyesight. Even if it was just a naked eye, he could tell that this was definitely not an ordinary weapon. What surprised Heath even more was that he could feel several strong elemental fluctuations from the blade. In other words, this sword was a wizard tool, at least an official wizard tool. Chapter 196, Red Demon. This sword obviously had an extraordinary origin. Right after Robert took out the sword, Heath noticed that the expressions of the surrounding generals were somewhat strange. Robert smiled and said, "It's rare to meet a wizard who also cultivates swordsmanship like me. I don't have any gifts for you, so I'll give you a handy weapon." Baxter, who was beside him, reminded him, "Wizard Heath, this red demon is a treasure that has been following Robert's lead for many years." Red demon. Heath was shocked. He had learned about this sword from the soul fragments he had extracted. It was a cross sword that was very famous in the bloody battlefield and even in the Tower of Order. It was said that the raw material used to forge it was part of the body of the flame demon Everett. It had been forged by the most outstanding dwarven craftsman in the West Coast, and finally, it was personally enchanted by a stigmata wizard. It was a rather high-level wizard tool. Heath immediately said, "I appreciate your kindness, but I'll pass." The red demon itself was custom-made for Robert by the stigmata wizard, and it had followed Robert in battle for many years. It was already a type of personal keepsake. Robert smiled and said, "There's no need to worry too much. No matter how high-level a wizard tool is, it's still just an item. Only by giving it to the right person can it show its true value. Now, it's no longer of much help to me." Heath was still a little hesitant. "This?" Robert put on a straight face and said, "Sir, are you preparing to humiliate me, Robert?" Seeing that, Heath could not say anything else. After taking over Red Demon, the moment he came into contact with it, Heath immediately felt a surge of elemental fluctuations coming from above. There was also a burning and violent power mixed within, even if it was just held in his hand. It was as if his blood was on fire. Robert asked, "How is it? Do you like it?" Heath could not put it down and said, "I've never received such a surprising gift. Ever since Black Dragon was broken, he did not have any weapons that he could bear anymore. Although he had changed many crossguard swords over the years and even tried to forge a wizard tool himself, he had never been able to find a suitable one. Now that the red demon had arrived, it was really suitable. However, at this moment, a cloud of black gas suddenly surged from the blade and quickly attacked Heath. He quickly let go of the hilt and held it with the wizard's hand. However, even so, the cloud of black gas could still spread along the wizard's hand. He had no choice but to completely let go of the restriction on the blade and let it fall straight to the ground. Heath looked at the black gas and said with a strange expression, "This is a wraith." From the black gas, one could clearly feel an extremely heavy resentment, and it was the same feeling as the wraith he had seen on the battlefield. Robert nodded and said, "Everett. Since you know about the red demon, you should also know that the red demon is made from Everett's body tissue. It contains an extremely heavy component of the wraith." Heath was puzzled. "It's not purified." Robert shook his head. "It can't be purified." Heath frowned. Heath had seen the strength of the wraith of Everett before. After being exposed to this kind of thing for a long time, even a wizard could not guarantee that he would not be contaminated. If he wanted to use it, he would probably have to completely mutate his soul. However, at this moment, Robert said, "Don't worry. If you were an ordinary wizard, you would definitely be devoured by the red demon. However, apart from that, you are also a Grand Knight." Heath raised his eyebrows. "Grand Knight?" Robert nodded. "The power of a Grand Knight can neutralize the resentment of wraiths. I'll explain it to you in detail another day. Today is a banquet. It's a time to enjoy." After that, everyone chatted about some random things. Robert gave Heath 2 gifts. One was the water of immortality of the elf clan. This was extracted from the immortal spring of the elf clan. It was a specialty of the elf clan. As its name suggested, it was used to increase vitality. Heath's vitality was still a little short of the peak of the wizard level. With this water of immortality, he could just rise to the peak. The other gift was a change in Heath's position. He was transferred from the front line to the Round Table Conference. This was probably a military department similar to the Strategic Staff Department. It mainly participated in military deployment and basically did not need to go to the front line. This was good news. After all, being far from the front line meant being far away from the risk. One had to know that the death rate on the bloody battlefield was extremely high. Take the battlefield that day as an example. In just a few short hours, hundreds of warriors had died in battle, and the entire bloody fortress only had a total of over 30,000 people. From this, one could see the terrifying casualty rate. The battle that day could be considered light in the bloody fortress. The wave of wraiths that had attacked did not even have a single high-ranked species. The truly terrifying impact. In the bloody battlefield, there were already more than 1 or 2 official-level wizards who had died on the front lines. There was only one substitute doll, so it was best not to use it if possible. It was worth mentioning that when Robert announced that Heath would be transferred to the Round Table, the generals present had their doubts. They were not deliberately targeting Heath, but was simply because this department was too important. However, after Robert recounted Heath's previous performance in the human world's battlefield, this doubt also disappeared. At this time, everyone knew that this young man in front of them not only had the strength of an official wizard and a grand knight, but also had extremely high talent and attainments in the military. He was truly an exceptional talent. Talent was welcomed everywhere, especially in Robert, the commander who valued talent like his life. Anyone could see Robert's admiration for Heath. In time, one could foresee the rise of a new upstart in the wizard world. After the banquet. Then it's settled. Wizard Heath, after I'm done with my work, I'll look for you to discuss the mysteries of ice magic. Of course. Wizard Baxter and Heath left the banquet hall while chatting and laughing. During the banquet, both parties briefly exchanged some magic experience. Baxter was surprised to find that Heath's grasp of basic knowledge was unexpectedly firm. Originally, it was just a casual exchange of ice magic with him, but now, he really had the intention to do this. Thus, after the banquet ended, both parties agreed to visit another day to discuss ice magic. After sending Baxter into the carriage, Heath also walked towards his own carriage. Here, his 3 apprentices, Martha and the other 2, had already been waiting for him. When they saw Heath coming over, the 3 of them immediately went up to him, carrying a cane and a coat. They looked like they were ready to be called. Lord Heath, let me help you with your cane. Wizard Heath, it's a bit cold outside. Let me put on a cloak for you. Wizard Heath. In fact, Martha and Roval were both purebloods from the wizard family. When they found out that they had been assigned by their family to be a Muggle's follower, they were somewhat reluctant. Their attitude towards Heath was only superficial respect. However, after this banquet, the 3 apprentices only had respect for Heath. The Bloody Fortress commander, Wizard Robert, personally received him, even gave him a sword, Red Demon, and the Round Table. Even a fool could tell that Heath was very popular. Wizard Heath. Just as Heath was about to board the carriage, a shout came from behind. He turned around and saw a knight running from behind. The knight came to Heath, bowed, and said, "Hello, Wizard Heath. I'm a knight of the Partridge family. Our young master is in the carriage over there. He wants to invite you to meet him." Partridge? Heath was puzzled. "What's the matter?" The knight said, "I'm not sure. I'm just here to deliver a message from the young master." Heath thought for a moment and said, "Okay." Partridge was one of the most prestigious wizard families in the West Coast. He was also one of the 4 most important families in the Tower of Order. He had to give him some face. Following the knight, Heath came to the lawn next to it. There was a gorgeous carriage parked there. The carriage did not look big, but it was surprisingly spacious inside. There were sofas, coffee tables, and other things. There was even a pool not far away. At this time, there were 2 young and beautiful girls playing in the pool. A young man in his 20s was sitting on the sofa by the pool, holding some grapes and other fruits to feed to the girls in the pool. After carefully observing Heath, he realized that the 2 girls had fish-like parotid glands on their bodies. They were obviously 2 lake banshees. What a high-end spatial spell! Looking around the carriage, Heath was a little surprised. Although he basically knew the principle of this carriage's spell, the materials needed to make such an exquisite arrangement were not to be underestimated. "Young master, Wizard Heath is here." The knight stepped forward and bowed. The man threw the food in his hand into the pool, then left the sofa and walked towards Heath. He warmly greeted, "Wizard Heath, would it be inconvenient for you to suddenly be disturbed?" Heath shook his head and said, "Young Master Winston, you are too kind." Heath had met this young man at the banquet. His name was Winston Partridge, a pure blood of the Partridge family, and his identity was very valuable. After a pause, Heath asked while keeping a distance, "May I know why you are looking for me, young Master Partridge?" Heath had heard about the Partridge family when he was in Shadow Tower. The reputation of his family was not very good, so it was better not to have fewer dealings with them if it was not necessary. Partridge said, Let's sit and talk." Heath and he sat on the sofa. Then, a servant brought tea and drinks. He drank the dragon blood wine and ate the heart of the forest, which was the size of a radish. They were all extremely expensive ingredients in the wizard world, the kind that cost thousands of magic stones per unit. After eating something symbolically, Partridge immediately explained the purpose of his visit. He went straight to the point. "It's like this. This time, I invited Wizard Heath over because I want to discuss something with you, Wizard Heath." Chapter 197, Mutation. Bloody Fortress, Stardust Tower, Square Parking Lot. "That's a pity." In front of the carriage, Winston sent Heath off the carriage with a disappointed look. After a pause, he put on a smile again. "But I hope you can consider it carefully, sir. The help our Partridge family can bring to you is definitely beyond your imagination." Heath said awkwardly, "Sir." Winston did not want to talk to him about anything else. He just wanted to rope him in, or rather, recruit him. He hoped that he could also serve as a deacon of the Partridge family. It was supposed to be a good thing to be recruited, but this was the Bloody Fortress. It was forbidden to form cliques in the Bloody Fortress, and Robert was also very wary of these things. Moreover, he had just received Robert's favor and was even willing to transfer him to the Round Table Conference. After that, if he ran to collude with the Partridge family. If this spread and Robert found out, what would people think? However, before he could finish speaking, Winston interrupted, "Wizard Heath, I don't want your answer now. I just hope that you can consider it and don't rush to give me an answer." He said confidently, "I believe that after you seriously consider it, you will definitely accept my proposal. In that case, I look forward to your good news." After saying that, he did not wait for Heath's reply and went inside. Heath frowned. He had heard that this Partridge family's way of doing things was overbearing. Today, he had truly experienced it. What was this? They would not give up until they achieved their goal? After thinking for a while, Heath decided to ignore him for the time being. He had already said and made clear what he should say and what he should say. The huge Partridge family should not be so stubborn as to go against him over such a small matter, right? Even if that was the case, Robert was the one who had the final say in this bloody fortress. It would not be difficult for him. In the next few days, Winston sent people to persuade Heath a few times, but Heath rejected them all. Probably because he saw that Heath's attitude was too firm, Winston seemed to have given up after failing a few times, so he did not send people again. There was no retaliation, and everything was very calm. In the next few meetings in the fortress, Winston did not show any hostility. He only expressed his regret for not being able to recruit Heath twice. In short, this little episode was over. Heath did not pay attention to it anymore. Instead, he focused on his cultivation. Bloody Fortress, Heath's room, cultivation room. In the closed cultivation room, a long white candle was sizzling and burning. The jumping flames scattered across the entire room. Different from ordinary candles, the light emitted by this candle was not strong, but it could fill the entire room. At the same time, under the candle light, sparks could be seen from time to time. It was as if something invisible in the air had been burned. This kind of candle was called the purifying candle. As the name suggested, this was a candle with purifying effects. It could burn and purify the elemental impurities in the current area, especially against negative energy particles such as wraiths. Because of wraiths, the negative energy particles in the entire bloody battlefield were extremely heavy. In such a place, if a wizard meditated and practiced, they would absorb these negative energy particles and cause themselves to be polluted. At the very least, they would become eccentric and crazy. At the very most, they would become a monster step by step. In order to allow the wizard apprentices in the fortress to cultivate in peace, the fortress had specially prepared a series of tools to purify the negative energy particles, and this purifying candle was one of them. In front of the purifying candle, Heath was sitting cross-legged in the middle of a magic array. This was a strange magic array, made up of a main array and several separate channeling magic arrays. On top of the channeling magic array were all sorts of materials such as star spirit grass, death soul flower, mutant plant, and so on. Any wizard who was familiar with the steps of the wizard level would be able to recognize at a glance that these materials were materials that belonged to soul mutation. And this magic array was also a magic array for soul mutation. TSS. TSS. The flames jumped unceasingly, and the various soul mutation materials that belonged to the magic array slowly converted into pure alienation energy along with the operation of the magic array. They flowed along the guiding lines of the magic array towards Heath. In the sea of consciousness, Heath's light blue soul sat cross-legged. The mutation energy that seeped in all converged here and finally flowed towards his chest. There was a ball of white. The white, which was originally only the size of a thumb, had expanded to the size of a fist after days of hard work. This was the current progress of his soul's mutation. The so-called soul's mutation was actually a way to change the structure of the soul and make the soul more suitable for the elements. The mutation of the original soul and the assimilation of the elements. Originally, there was a certain rejection reaction between the soul of a wizard and the elements. Before becoming an intermediate level wizard, the wizard did not need too much soul energy, so the rejection did not affect them. However, after becoming an intermediate level wizard, the soul energy required would have a qualitative leap. At this time, if there was still rejection, it would lose a lot of soul energy, and it might even cause a certain amount of danger to the soul. Therefore, the soul had to be mutated. Only when the soul's mutation rate exceeded 30% could one break through to become an intermediate level wizard, and only when it reached 80% could one break through to become an advanced level wizard. Time passed by bit by bit. After 2/3 of the purifying candle had been burned, crisp kika sounds came one after another from the respective magic arrays. It was the sound of the mutated materials that had been drained of energy breaking. As the energy was drained, the materials on the respective magic arrays gradually lost their color and withered. In the end, they were like burnt paper. With a series of cracking sounds, they completely turned into a pile of powder. When the last dissimilated material turned into powder, the dissimilation this time also ended. Following that, Heath slowly opened his eyes. Phew, he sighed and opened the system interface to take a look. On the message board, there was a row of clear words. Mutation value increased by 2,862. Current mutation rate, 6%. After the system upgrade, Heath found that the system's display had also been greatly improved. In the past, it could only display attributes, but now it could display other more detailed physical states. Take this soul mutation for example. Now, after each mutation, he would be able to obtain the specific energy value and degree of mutation. This saved him a lot of effort. Otherwise, if he wanted to know the specific value, not only would he need to use a special wizard tool, but he would also need to consume a large number of magic stones. And this was only one of the items. Touching his chin, Heath said, 2,862? Then with the previous extraction, the mutation value is almost 4,000. The system's return allowed Heath to increase the mutation energy in addition to his training. Extraction. Yes, through Heath's experiments, he found that the mutation energy could also be extracted. For example, he had extracted the materials he used to absorb the mutation before he absorbed them. He had obtained more than 1,000 mutated energy. At this rate, I might be able to raise my soul's mutation rate to 100% before I advance to an intermediate rank wizard. A low rank wizard with 100% soul's mutation rate. How abnormal is that? The higher the soul's mutation rate, the more precise the wizard's control over his spiritual power and the higher the energy released. It was an important item that could directly affect the power of spells. After the outbreak of the Wraith Tide, there would not be any more Wraith Tides in the short term. Because of this, the fortress was in a peaceful phase for the next period of time. During this period, Heath did not go anywhere and stayed in his room all day to train. Other than the necessary military meetings and some social events that could not be overthrown, the rest of his time was spent on training. During this process, Heath's strength also improved by leaps and bounds. He could feel the improvement every day. In addition to the improvement in wizards, there was also new progress in the night path. This progress came mainly from Wizard Robert. A few days later, Robert came to look for him, mainly to teach him how to use the Red Demon. During this lesson, he also learned about knights and swordsmanship that he did not know before. Chapter 198, Core. Bloody Fortress, Training Square. Whoosh! 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 The fierce sound of rushing wind could be heard. The cross-shaped sword pierced through the wind again and again, leaving behind patches of light and shadows in the air. The blade of the sword was brightly illuminated by the dancing braziers. In the square, Heath, who was dressed in a swordsman's uniform, was doing swordsmanship training. Although his focus had always been on the magic field, Heath's improvement in swordsmanship had not fallen behind over the years. He would complete at least one swordsmanship training and combat aura training every day. Under his hard work, the improvement was significant. Strength 52.3, Agility 62.8, Vitality 48.6. The three attributes of a knight had reached around 50, especially Agility, which had reached more than 60. Even without using magic, Heath could still have the speed of an apprentice using Gale. It was truly terrifying. Soon, the sword dance ended, and Heath sheathed his cross sword. At this moment, there was a round of applause outside the square. Clap! 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 Heath turned his head and saw a middle-aged man standing at the side of the square. His entire body naturally exuded a heroic aura. It was none other than the commander of the Bloody Fortress, Robert. Heath bowed and said, "Commander Robert." Robert smiled confidently and said, "You dance well. Your swordsmanship alone can be ranked in the top 10 among the swordsmanship masters in the West Coast." Heath said humbly, "Thank you." There was a weapon rack at the side of the square. Robert walked over and took a cross-shaped sword from it. He pulled out his sword aura and walked into the square. "Let's have a match." Heath raised his eyebrows. "Swordsmanship?" Robert nodded. "Swordsmanship, according to the knight's tradition." Heath did not refuse. After greeting each other according to the knight's etiquette, both parties took dozens of steps back in the square. Standing still, Heath held his sword with both hands. The blade of the sword was 45 degrees up, and he was in a starting position. Robert, on the other hand, was just standing there foolishly with his crossguard sword in one hand. Heath raised his eyebrows. "Your Excellency." The starting position was a crucial part of swordsmanship. An outstanding starting position could allow a knight to gain an advantage at the start of a battle, and even directly determine the final outcome. Robert smiled and said, "Go ahead and attack." Heath frowned, feeling a little unhappy. He was the champion of the Elund tournament and the famous black-haired knight of the Helen Kingdom. When had he ever been looked down on by anyone? Robert saw that Heath was unhappy, but he did not correct it. Instead, he continued to add fuel to the fire by provoking him. "Why? Are you going to hatch an egg there, sir?" Heath did not try to control his emotions. He said arrogantly, "The last guy who talked nonsense in front of me has already become a ghost under my sword." Robert continued to provoke him. "The taste of defeating a third-rate swordsman is not bad, right? You will pay the price for your arrogance. Then come." As a temporary judge announced the start. Boom! Heath disappeared from where he was. In the next second, he appeared in front of Robert and raised the cross sword in his hand, slashing down. This sword was like a rainbow, like a bolt of lightning that tore through the sky. It had already reached the peak of Heath's speed. He was also confident that this was the peak of swordsmanship. However, in the next second, he realized that he was wrong, and he was ridiculously wrong. The momentum of the sword approached the door, and Robert finally moved. He did not have any special movements or moves. It was as if he just casually grabbed the cross-shaped sword and swung it at Heath's cross-shaped sword. His movements were so casual, as if it was child's play. However, just such a casual sword could only be heard. Clang! A cross blade flew up into the sky, spinning and landing on the ground. Then, with a cha sound, it stabbed diagonally into the ground. In the square, Heath's hands were empty, and his expression was as dumb as a wooden chicken. Robert was still holding the sword easily, as if he was on an outing. He laughed and said, "How is it? A third-rate swordsman?" Heath was shocked. But at the same time, he was also excited. He asked, "Can I try again?" Robert nodded. "Yes." Heath walked over and picked up the crossguard sword, then attacked Robert twice. But the outcome was the same. No matter what starting stance he used, no matter how he attacked, Robert would defeat him with a wave of his hand. After the third attack, Robert said, "Let's stop here." The gap is too big. No matter how many times you try, it's useless. These words sounded very harsh, but Heath also knew that Robert was telling the truth. He put away the crossguard sword and frowned as he fell into deep thought. Seeing this, Robert could not help but ask, "Are you curious about where you lost?" Heath nodded. This was something that he could not understand. They were all grand knights. Although he could not see Robert's specific attributes, he could feel that Robert was not much stronger than him in terms of attributes. They were basically on the same level. Other than the difference in strength, what made Heath even more shocked was the aspect of moves. One had to know that over the years, Heath had occupied the system, so he did not know how many sword techniques he had learned. Not to mention that they were all over the Western continent, but he had basically mastered all of the sword techniques in the Underdark Tresia. Right now, he was definitely a sword master and an expert. But just now, he could not see what moves or sword paths Robert had used to defeat him. It was as if he had really just casually swung his sword at himself, and then he was defeated. What he used could not even be considered a sword technique. Heath said sincerely, "Please enlighten me, sir." Robert nodded. Then, he explained, "There are no problems with your fundamentals. Your strength and speed are very good, especially your sword technique. I can see that you have a solid grasp of this aspect. You must have learned quite a few sword paths." Pausing for a moment, he continued, "The real gap between us is in the realm of swordsmanship." Heath asked in puzzlement, "Realm?" Robert said, "Yes, the realm of swordsmanship and the understanding of swordsmanship." Heath pricked up his ears and waited for the rest of the story. However, as if deliberately keeping him in suspense, Robert was not in a hurry to explain. Instead, he suddenly asked, "Before that, I have a question to ask you." Heath said, "Please go ahead." Robert asked, "Are you preparing to use swordsmanship as the core of your magic and become your regular magic?" Heath was puzzled. "Magic core? Regular magic?" Robert said, "It seems that you don't know anything." "Heath." Robert continued to ask, "What do you think is the biggest difference between us wizards and mortals?" Heath thought for a moment. "Powerful strength? Abnormal constitution? Long lifespan?" Robert said, "What you said is all true." After a pause, he continued, "But the most important thing is time. Compared to ordinary humans, we have more time and longer lifespan. This time allows us to understand the world more. We can integrate what we understand into our magic and build a set of rules and fields that belong to us." Heath seemed to understand but not understand. Robert continued to ask, "I don't know if you've noticed, but many powerful wizards, especially stigmata wizards, have specialties other than magic, such as music, poetry, sculpture, and so on." Heath thought for a moment and said, "It seems to be true. Just like how humans like to talk about their idols, stigmata level was one of the topics that the apprentices talked about the most when they were in Shadow Tower. Every apprentice was familiar with the experiences of stigmata wizards." Just now, with Robert's reminder, he thought for a moment and indeed, as he said, many stigmata wizards, apart from being a wizard, also had part-time jobs such as musicians, craftsmen, painters, and so on. Some were even famous in history. For example, the wizard master of the Tower of Order, the ruler of the Western continent, Babatos. Besides being a wizard, he was also one of the most outstanding painters in the Western continent. His paintings in the human world could almost be said to be priceless treasures. Robert continued to ask, "Why do you think these wizards waste their time and energy to learn these messy things?" Heath was stunned. Robert's question really stumped him. Why? Hobbies? Were they bored with too much time to kill time? Did they need a reason to learn things? Heath shook his head. "I don't know." He had never thought of this question before. Robert said, "This is related to the core of magic. We all know what magic is. It is nothing more than a cluster of energy particles arranged and combined according to specific rules and principles to form a powerful energy that can summon wind and rain, live forever, and so on." He asked, "Then where did these rules and principles come from?" Heath replied, "From observing nature. There were records in the book that the first wizards observed nature, observed the burning of flames, simulated fire-type spells, observed the falling of lightning, and simulated lightning-type spells." Robert praised, "Not bad, your foundation is very solid." After a pause, he continued to explain, "Yes, wizard spells are formally derived from the understanding and simulation of the laws of nature. However, the laws of nature are not limited to these. He casually swung his sword forward, and the space twisted, as if the entire space had been cut open. Heath's eyes lit up at this scene. Because he could clearly feel that when Robert swung his sword just now, there were elemental fluctuations. In other words, this sword was not a sword technique, but magic. Robert continued to explain, sword techniques that can kill enemies are a kind of rule, and music that is pleasing to the ear is also a kind of rule. Painting that is pleasing to the eye is also a kind of rule. We can imitate the wind, we can imitate the rain, so why can't we imitate sword techniques? Why can't we imitate music? Heath was stunned. Robert said, using magic to imitate sword techniques, music, or using sword techniques and music to release magic, combining the two into one, and using it as the core to create magic. This kind of magic is also called rule magic by us wizards, and wizards who are used to using this kind of magic are also called rule wizards. Chapter 199, Sword Realm. Using swordsmanship to release magic? Heath was beginning to understand. Robert said, the further you go on the path of wizards, the more important it is to understand and use the rules. There is a huge difference in the strength of wizards at the same level. Most of the time, it is because of the rules and the laws. Heath understood this deeply. After all, he had personally experienced the power of the rules. Robert said, if you want to establish a relevant system of rules with a certain kind of affairs as the core, you must have a sufficient understanding and thorough understanding of this kind of affairs. And this is the gap between you and me in terms of swordsmanship. Your swordsmanship is still on the surface. To you, swordsmanship is just simple swordsmanship, stuck between one move and one move. But to me, swordsmanship is the core of my spell. It is a set of rules, a part of the operation of the world, and a way to use power. Robert said, this understanding has improved my swordsmanship realm. It allows me to easily see the shortcomings of your swordsmanship and find a strategy to deal with it so that I can send your cross-sword flying. Heath suddenly understood. Robert asked, then, back to the original question, do you intend to use swordsmanship as the core of your spell to create your own rule system? Understanding every rule is extremely difficult, especially for the core of the rule system. Wizards can understand many rules and principles, but there can only be one for the core of the building of their own system. This is determined at the soul level. Many systems are very dangerous, and wizards who try this are basically crazy. Robert said, if you have the consideration of swordsmanship as the core, I can tell you about what I know in the swordsmanship rule system that I have comprehended. I can give you a reference. Otherwise, this topic will end here. Heath looked troubled. Before this, these were all knowledge levels that he had never come into contact with, not to mention thinking about them. This was unexpected. How would he know how to answer them? Perhaps he also felt that his question was asking too much. Robert changed the topic and said, forget it, I'll give you a simple demonstration first. As for whether or not to use swordsmanship as the core in the end, that's up to you. Heath said, thank you. Robert held the cross-shaped sword and retreated a distance. Watch carefully. As he spoke, he held the cross-shaped sword and stabbed forward. This was a sword that was extremely fast. This was a sword that had no flaws. Heath did not even see his movements clearly before he attacked. With the sword, tens of thousands of sword shadows appeared in the air. It was as if thousands of soldiers and horses were charging forward, the power was terrifying. Robert put away the cross-shaped sword and asked, how do you feel? Heath thought for a moment and said, fast, sharp, perfect. Robert smiled and said, no wonder you can use such a beautiful sword technique. You are indeed very talented. He nodded and said, that's right. The key point of this realm is speed and sharpness. To practice the sword technique to the extreme and to bring the speed of the sword technique to the peak. Most of the sword saints and sword gods recorded in history and talked about by bards have reached this realm. If it is combined with magic. Robert paused for a moment, then raised his sword again and stabbed forward in the same way. The same sword left thousands of sword shadows in the air. But after this sword attack, the space where each sword shadow was distorted, as if this sword attack had pierced thousands of holes in the air. Heath opened his mouth. As a force field wizard, he was very clear about the power of Robert's sword attack. He had added a force field spell array into this sword attack. The holes that were created in the air were not illusions. They were really created by him. Heath took a deep breath. Such a spell. He could feel that the energy unit created by this sword attack was no less than 1,000 degrees. If he were to face this sword attack, he would probably be torn to pieces in an instant, without any chance to resist. And such a terrifying power was just a casual sword from Robert. Robert smiled and said, "How is it? Are you more interested in the rules of swordsmanship?" Heath nodded. "Never before." Robert said, "Look at this sword again." He then stabbed forward again. The structure of this sword was the same as the previous one. It was also a sword that split into thousands of sword shadows in the air. However, the difference was that this time, the distorted sword shadows were no longer as orderly as before. Instead, they were arranged in an irregular manner, like a handful of sand that was casually thrown out, making it impossible for people to see the rules and moves. Robert said, "The characteristic of this realm is change. When a move reaches its peak, the sword technique will no longer be restricted to one move. Instead, it will be flexible and change, allowing one sword technique to be in a changeable state, making it impossible for the opponent to understand. If combined with magic." He stabbed once again. Similarly, thousands of distorted holes were once again pierced through the air by him. However, this time, these distorted holes were actually constantly jumping and changing, making it difficult for one to guard against them. Heath simulated it in his mind. Putting aside that terrifying power, just this sword path that was constantly changing was enough to make one not know how to guard against it, making it impossible for one to find a way to block it. Robert said, "Next is the heavy sword realm." He swung his sword again. It was the complete opposite of the previous fast sword. This was a very slow and heavy sword. It was extremely slow, as if an old man was practicing Tai Chi. It was as if Robert was not holding a sword, but a mountain. However, for some reason, Heath felt that this sword seemed to contain infinite power. Whoosh! As the sword was swung out, a thick sound of wind breaking rang out. Under the blade of the sword, a gust of sword wind actually rose up and pounced onto the ground. The soil was separated on both sides, and a clear and straight sword scar appeared. Robert said, "The key to this realm is not in the sword, but in the comprehension of the level of power. Lifting something heavy as if it were light, lifting something light as if it were heavy. At this time, the sword is only a carrier. What determines its power is the power it carries. After combining it with magic." Robert slowly swung his sword again. Puchy puchy. As the sword was slashed out, a crisp sound rang out. The space where the sword passed by actually began to distort and tear, as if it was slowly cutting a hole in the space. The seemingly ordinary sword actually directly tore apart the space. Robert retracted his cross sword. "How is it?" Heath's eyes lit up as he asked emotionally, Is there any more?" Swordsmanship was also a type of knowledge. Once he learned new knowledge, he would always become hungry. Robert nodded and said, "There are still 2 more realms, but I haven't comprehended it yet and I won't hide it from you. I've only heard that these 2 realms are combined with the laws." Heath was greatly disappointed. Robert shook his head and said, "It's wise to focus on the present. Facing knowledge far away is meaningless. Right now, you're still far from that level. You'd better learn what's in front of you well." Heath nodded. "I'll definitely remember it in my heart." Robert said, "I've just observed it. Your current strength is probably around the 1st realm. Your swordsmanship is already very solid. As long as you practice more, you'll be able to reach the 1st realm very quickly. I'll show you 2 more times. Try your best to learn and comprehend it. In addition, I'll explain to you the way to use Red Demon later. With the Knight's Heart, it's very easy. But you need to remember that swordsmanship isn't instant. Impatience won't bring about outstanding swordsmanship, and it will only bring about failure." On that day in the square, Robert told Heath a lot of knowledge about swordsmanship, which was very helpful to him. Not long after that, after careful consideration, Heath decided to use swordsmanship as the core of his rules to create a spell system that was suitable for swordsmanship. To become a true sword wizard. Chapter 200, War. The bloody battlefield was a defensive war that took place in the west of the wizard world. It would take place every 100 years. Every 100 years, the magic array set up in the sealed land needed to clean up the accumulated negative energy particles. When it was lifted, the power of the seal would be weakened, and the wraiths in the sealed land would explode, forming a tide of wraiths. If the wraiths were not stopped from rushing out of the sealed land, they would threaten the entire west coast. And because of that, whenever the tide of wraith erupted, the ruler of the west coast, the Tower of Order, would summon the wizards of the west coast to the bloody battlefield to fight against the tide of wraiths. The entire period would be from 3 to 5 months to several years. During this period, the wizards needed to block the onslaught of the wraiths again and again, until the magic circle in the sealed land was restored. In the sealed land, at the bloody fortress, another round of fortress defense battle had begun. Woo-oh! The deep sound of a bugle horn resounded in the sky. On the towering city wall, teams of warriors in bright armor walked up the city wall. Under the leadership of their respective commanders, they stood at the front line. Humans, elves, dwarves, knights, and wizards. Release the arrows. Magic. All kinds of battle commands rang out around the battlements. One by one, basic commanders were waving their cross swords and shouting at the top of their lungs. Along with their orders, arrows shot into the sky like rain. With the support of magic, they brought out all kinds of beams of light, like ribbons dancing in high control, and then slammed heavily into the ground. Boom! 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 The sound of explosions could be heard continuously. All kinds of magic beams exploded under the city tower. Flames, frost, lightning, and all kinds of magic devoured and wreaked havoc in the army of wraiths. At the same time, the army of wraiths also launched an attack. Groups of skeletons shot long bone spears into the sky. Under the full force attacks of these pitchers, which were no less than knights, the javelins easily climbed up the city tower that was hundreds of meters high and stabbed straight at the warriors on the battlements. Although the commanders at all levels had ordered the heavy shield warriors to defend at the first moment, they were still unable to deal with the swift and fierce javelins. There were frequent casualties. First, an elf was slow in evading and did not manage to hide behind the heavy shield. He was immediately pierced through the chest by the bone spears. The powerful impact sent the elf flying back dozens of meters and nailed him to the battlements behind him. Then, a few more shields were pierced by the bone spears, and the dwarves' heads and chests exploded. The cracked brains and blood splattered all over the ground, dyeing the city wall red. Roar! There was no time to accept this cruel scene, and a terrible roar had already sounded. In the wilderness below the city wall, a few giant trees that were dozens of meters or nearly 100 meters tall appeared. Their branches and leaves had completely withered, and there were a few holes on the trunk that made up their facial features, with dark green flames burning inside. Forest treant. This was a species among the lower treant species of the forest race. Originally, the neutral race would not rashly launch an attack, but now, their bodies and souls had been completely eroded and polluted by the wraiths. The long branches that grew from the depths of the giant trees that came to the city tower rolled up the giant rocks on the ground and threw them toward the city tower. These giant rocks that weighed thousands of kilograms were like light toys in front of the forest treants. They were easily thrown hundreds of meters into the air and smashed toward the city tower. Buzz! Buzz! At the same time, a sound that sounded like bees flapping their wings rang out. Many strange creatures flew out from the center of the forest treant's hollow trunk. They were palm-sized little people, wearing clothes wrapped in tree bark and with sharp wings on their backs. Forest goblins. They were also a member of the forest clan and belonged to the goblin species. They usually accompanied the forest treant and could release some simple spells. Their strength was about the same as an ordinary apprentice. Dozens or hundreds of forest treants flew up the battlements in groups, and they cast fireballs, ice arrows, and other kinds of spells at the warriors on the battlements. Under the interference of the magic, there was a commotion in the front row. The archers could not dodge for a moment, the heavy shield soldiers could not hold the heavy shields in their hands. Gaps appeared in the originally solid defense line. And what awaited them was the giant rocks and bone spears that flew up from behind. They were smashed into meat paste, nailed to the floor, and blood splattered everywhere. Magic! Give us the help of magic! Hurry up and chase away these damned fairies! The commanders tried their best to maintain the situation while shouting at the top of their lungs, seeking the help of the wizards. Screams, commands, and howls of all kinds rang out continuously, and the entire battlements were in complete chaos. On the side of the battlements, Heath was carefully observing the battlefield ahead under the protection of a few personal guards. In fact, after he was transferred to the Round Table Conference, his duty had also changed from a basic-level artillery station to a military staff officer. He was mainly engaged in strategic deployment and military planning, so there was no need for him to personally come to the front line. However, in line with the principle of his position, he still came up. After all, he really stood on the front line and participated in the defense of the city, fighting side by side with other warriors, only then would he be able to understand what the warriors on the battlefield lacked, and the strategic deployment would be more accurate and effective. In addition, he could also do some private research. In any case, as a wizard and Grand Knight, his own survival ability was still very high. He would not die so easily. Moreover, at the very least, he still had a substitute doll to take care of him. You guys wait here. I'll go up and take a look. After saying this, Heath ignored the objections of his personal guards and walked straight to the battlefield on the front line. The silver-white mimicry shield pulled open the defense in front of Heath. The bone spear that seemed unstoppable hit it, but it did not move at all. The forest fairies next to him quickly discovered that he was an unusual creature. Groups of them flew toward him and began to bombard him. But similarly, apprentice-level spells had quantity but no quality. It would take a long time to break through Heath's mimicry shield. Heath then began to do his own research in peace. He casually waved his hand, and the wizard's hand grabbed out. A forest goblin was pulled back by a strong suction force and flew into his hand. Heath looked down at the little monster. Forest goblins were a relatively rare magical creature, and they had a certain amount of intelligence that could help a wizard complete some magic tasks. Therefore, many wizards like to keep them as companions. In particular, forest goblins with outstanding innate talent had always been the favorite of the world of companions, worth millions. Unfortunately, these forest goblins had already been contaminated, and their souls had been completely eroded. Now, they could only grimace at Heath and try to struggle and attack. It was impossible for them to become companions anymore. Holding the forest goblin, Heath began his own research. He wanted to see if he could extract the wraith's negative energy. These wraiths were also magical creatures and extraordinary beings. In theory, they could be extracted after death. If the experiment was successful. Just look at the dense army of ants outside. One could imagine how exciting it would be. Of course, it was not that easy to deal with them in practice. If one wanted to extract them, they had to keep the completed body. However, the wraiths had a level 3 undead characteristic. This level of undead power had already corroded every cell. Normally, when dealing with wraiths, there were two ways to deal with them. One was to destroy the physical body completely, or the other was to use purification, directly targeting the wraith in the body. However, once the wraith was purified, its self-protection mechanism would form a backlash and burn the main body. Without the completed corpse, there was naturally no way to extract it. Let's try purification first. Thinking to himself, Heath cast purification on the forest goblin. This was a very basic apprentice spell, positive energy type, no attributes. The moderate and peaceful purification power surged into the forest goblin's body and began to clear the wraith in its body. However, at the same time, the wraith also began to counterattack on the verge of death. Sizzle sizzle. A series of crisp sizzling sounds could be heard as white smoke rose from the surface of the forest goblin's body. Then, with a bang sound, it directly burned into a ball of white flames. In an instant, the forest goblin was extinguished in the flames. As expected, it didn't work. Then what if I first drive the wraiths to a certain part? While he was thinking, Heath casually grabbed another forest goblin. This time, he did not directly purify it. Instead, he first extended his spiritual tentacles into the forest goblin's body and drove away the wraiths in the forest goblin's body. This time, it worked very well. Through his spiritual power, Heath successfully gathered all the wraiths in the forest goblin's body onto one of its arms. He then cut off the arm and immediately purified it. The arm burst into flames, but the forest goblin's corpse remained intact. Haha, success! Heath immediately said to the forest goblin in his hand, extract. Beep, extraction successful. Spiritual power plus 0.06. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained forest goblin's life sequence. Beep, extraction successful. Obtained talent fireball. Beep, extraction successful. Fire law +1. Pure spiritual energy and strange information surged into Heath's mind, including the life sequence of the forest goblins, the talent spell of the forest goblins, and even the law power of the fire element. The upgraded system is indeed extraordinary. Heath was overjoyed. Heath, who had tasted the sweetness, immediately increased his strength. While constantly capturing and purifying the forest goblins, he also constantly tried to improve his purification method. With his help, the pressure on the battlements was indirectly alleviated. As he killed the forest goblins one by one, the warriors who no longer had to deal with these small monsters could once again raise their shields to defend and avoid attacks. The war continued. The wraiths would attack the fortress every now and then. At this time, Heath would also stand at the front line to help defend the city while waiting for an opportunity to extract. With this endless supply of targets to extract, his strength was also improving rapidly with each passing day.